All right, welcome everyone, and we have a full house today. And our guest with us today is Dr. Michael Vanden Heuvel. And Doctor, just so you know, so usually we don't have this many people at committee, but the permanent members would be Minister Compton, Lynn Lund, Stephen Howard, Robert Henderson, and Hal Perry. But also with us today as guests would be Ole Hammerlin, Michelle Beaton, and Sidney McEwen. And do we have someone to move the adoption of the agenda? Minister Compton, thank you. And I guess with that, Doctor, we'll give the floor over to you for your presentation, and I think what we'll do is probably just wait until the end, and then we can do the questions at the end, if that works for you.
That's good.
All right, so the floor is yours, Doctor.
Thank you very much. I'll try and project as much as possible amongst all the sound barriers and construction going on. So I guess my invitation came out of comments to Deputy Minister Colwell regarding potential interest in a research project on water sustainability in Prince Edward Island. So I'm going to focus largely around what the nature of that research project will be. However, we have been doing such work already ongoing since 2016 in association with the Milton Vale well field. So I'll also be talking a little bit about that because I think there's things in there that address previous questions the committee has come up with from looking at the transcripts, as well as giving you some flavor for the sort of research we are proposing to do. So I haven't thought of a great title for this yet in 3 years, but call it Water Sustainability for PEI. It's about a lot more than just the big topic of irrigation. So as I hope you will realize. So obviously you have much background on the Water Act and the moratorium, so I need not go into that. So I will say, just in the way of a very quick introduction, I've been on Prince Edward Island for 15 years, and our lab, which is part of the Canadian Rivers Institute, has done a considerable amount of work on nutrients, sediments, contaminants, fish passage since 2005, and that's been in virtually every corner of Prince Edward Island. We also have done a bit of work on oil sands and pulp and paper mill too, just to keep us really busy. So, but a large part of the focus and the reason I was brought here by President Wade McLaughlin at the time as a Canada Research Chair, which ended about 5 years ago, was to address environmental issues on PEI. So we have had an existing project that is funded by the province of Prince Edward Island on municipal water extraction since 2016. There have been discussions of including agriculture into a scope of a similar project since 2017. Those discussions have been both with provincial officials as well as people representing the industry. So President government accepted exploratory permits for 4 wells in December 2019, and those are high capacity wells. However, to do this research, it was precluded by the early draft of the regulations on water extraction, which prohibits such research under the moratorium, which would be enshrined into the regulations. So if it was to remain as it was, that research could not happen under the regulations. So the proposal is, and I'll talk about this a little bit later too, to have a partly federally funded through the National Science and Engineering Research Council research partnership to fund this research on an ongoing basis. So I want to emphasize the term research partnership. I'm doing this deliberately. Last year's throne speech mentioned the need for research on water that is independent of government and industry. So I don't know if such research actually could exist in present day society. So and that's because the ongoing trend is for academics like myself to do research in partnership with stakeholders. So what does that mean? It means partners participate and own the research from start to finish. That includes right from the conception of research to the publication of the research. Direct involvement of those partners in a technical sense and in what areas they are capable of being involved. And of course, partnerships are relationships. You don't start with a partnership. So I've certainly had partnerships with many watershed groups. Those are ongoing and growing, and we will establish new partnerships as part of this. So why partnerships? It's the current federal model for almost all university research funding. They revamped some of their major funding programs about a year and a half ago. It's basically partners must have cash or you don't get research money federally in Canada, with some exceptions. So that's the way funding for research for universities works now. In Canada, it's been going that way for almost 40 years. So to bring up the amount of research money that's put in by the private sector in Canada, which was quite shockingly low. Credibility, so people being involved right from the start to the finish brings credibility. It brings communal research ownership. It brings transparency as well, that everybody can see the research. People are less likely to criticize you and poo-poo the research if they've been involved in it right since the very beginning, and they have a feeling that their opinion has been taken seriously. So, and really, I believe after being a fairly harsh critic of some environmental aspects of PEI in the past, I do believe that solutions will only come working together with all sectors and all people, so and all perspectives. So and for me, this is probably a swan song in my research career, and is really encouraging that we can do this at this point in time. So. Who would the partners be? Fisheries and Ocean Canada has confirmed their partnership through a letter from a regional director already. So Agriculture and Agri-Foods Canada has not yet confirmed. The province, probably multiple departments, certainly has been involved in this, and we would presume the involvement of the province, but not formally confirmed. PEI Federation of Agriculture is a confirmed partner. They will certainly be the main industry representative in this endeavor. So individual watershed groups, we've gone around in circles there in the sense that they were engaged 2 years ago already and we're more or less on side, and we have to revisit that engagement in terms of where we are today with those watershed groups to be involved. There's some interest from the PEI Horticultural Association, and it's a lie, I haven't invited them yet because I didn't get around to writing the letter this week, so as well as 3 participating universities. So we have a good variety of sectors, from provincial, federal government, from watershed groups as large, as well as from the industry as part of this. So. The research team, we've been talking about this for several years as well, in addition to myself, who will be the leader of this project out of UPEI. So it is a UPEI project in the sense it's led out of UPEI, but we've tried to find the best people that we could in the various aspects, including Dr. Saint-Hilaire from INRS in Quebec City, who's a modeler, has done a lot of climate work and looks at stream sediments and fish habitat, a hydrologist. Dave Burton from NSAC is very well known as a soil scientist, particularly looking at nutrient fate in soils. Daniel Casey is basically the environmental flows guy for the federal government, works out of Moncton. And Yifeng Jiang, who was the provincial hydrogeologist and moved on to AAFC, and probably knows more about the hydrogeology of PEI than anybody in existence. So certainly I couldn't, if I scoured all of Canada, I could not find a team better or more qualified or more well-known than this team to examine this topic. So while they are mostly from Eastern Canada. So what will we be studying? Well, environmental flows, as we know, is quite relevant to the Water Act and has been really the heart of a lot of the discussion around the regulations on water extraction. What do we mean when we say that? So, well, in 2007, about 700 scientists got together in Brisbane and made a very strong statement about environmental flows and the global importance of it. And they said environmental flows describe the quantity, timing, and quality of water flows required to sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems and the human livelihoods and well-being that depend on these ecosystems. So, and I think that was a very well-worded statement. I will point out, that's why I put it in italics, to remind me that the definition is in the Water Act, but the word quality is not included in the definition of environmental flows that is in the Water Act. So our question is obviously, what are safe levels of flows for PEI streams, along with that definition to sustain, particularly sustain freshwater and estuarine ecosystems. So, and this is the sort of work that is done on a fairly large geographical scale, from stream reaches to entire watersheds. I will diverge at this time to talk a little bit about what we've done already. So the proposal is that our Coles Creek or Milton Vale study, funded by the province since 2016, is going to be incorporated under the umbrella of this expanded project. So this project won't just be about agriculture, it's about water. Why? Funding. So we can actually leverage the existing funding that we have from the province and get federal money from that, because these programs only existed for a year and a half, so we've only been able to do that for a year and a half. So certainly engages the provincial partner inherently, because the provincial partner has been involved in this research. Historically, water extraction by municipalities is the largest water use issue in PEI. This is, I think, unquestionable. So scientifically, it really provides us with the worst case scenario for water extraction. So there is pumping out of a small watershed at up to 1,050 imperial gallons per minute, 365 days a year. So it doesn't get much worse than that. Complementary for understanding all flow reductions. So it's good to put this together with the agricultural scenario. It's a unique long-term monitoring study. We hope we can continue it for a few more years. It will be one of the longest ongoing studies of this nature completed in PEI or anywhere really. It's very unusual to have a 7 or 8 year long study, which is quite valuable in terms of how quickly things happen. So. And much of the methodology we've adapted or developed for Coles Creek will be used elsewhere on the island. So it makes sense for many reasons to combine this. So. Just to give you a very brief summary, because I realize time is not to my advantage in talking about this in detail, but the scope of work, environmental flows on Coles Creek. The Milton Vale well field consists of 5 wells, which you see as the red dots there, well down the watershed on Coles Creek. We ourselves have 2 flow monitoring stations, which are the green dots, one above the well field and one below the well field. We have an additional one on the Springvale branch of the North River, which is the tributary after the next one you see on the left. So there's also an Environment Canada flow monitoring station right in the middle of the well field. So as well, the black dots show a number of biological monitoring stations, particularly for fish, that we have along the river. So. However, our initial step was to evaluate the protectiveness of current PEI regulations for stream flow. So many jurisdictions around the world essentially use a number of hydrology metrics. So these are numbers that are summarized from what we know about stream flow. So as limits or regulations to protect that flow. So our provincial regulations are that we must maintain 70% of the median flow, which is basically on a monthly basis, because flow varies a lot from month to month. So for example, for the month of August, we would seek to always maintain a long-term average or long-term median of 50%. We would seek to maintain 70% of that. So it's quite a long document that's on the provincial website, but to make a long story short, we found that the current method used by PEI provides variable protection depending on the river. However, on average, it's the same it's about the same or slightly better than approaches used in other jurisdictions. So while I would always push to be a little bit more protective of the environment. So, and I would probably this basically says we shouldn't use any more than 30% of the flow. I'd sleep better at night if that number were 20. But there are some very compelling reasons why we can't make the guidelines more stringent at this point in time. So. So this is a historic flow number crunching exercise. So this is not validated by any biology or any studies we've done. So this is purely a paper exercise. So, and in fact, we could only get really good data on the median flow from a number of systems in PEI where we have measured flow for as far back as 1962, or the federal government has through their hydrometric stations. So, so it's actually not really easy to measure the median flow in any other stream in PEI, which is somewhat problematic, although there are ways we can estimate and get at that number. So, however, what I also want to emphasize is that it brings up the question, what's normal flow in any stream on PEI? So if we look at these 5 streams over a 50-year period, we can see normal is a highly variable concept. So certainly flow can vary by more than twofold from August to August. And we've chosen August as the period here because it most reliably has the lowest flow, and that's when we have the most concern for the flows in the river. So it's highly variable from year to year. However, there is no statistical evidence of changing over time. Some of them are going up, some of them are going down by the trend lines, but none of those are statistically significant changes. So there's just too much variability around there. So, so this gives you some sense of the challenge of determining, well, we're changing the flow in a system by pumping, so how much are we changing it by? Well, the question you have to start with, well, what's the normal flow to start with? And the answer is, it's quite variable. So you can also see in 2012 and 2013, we had some of the lowest flows seen in 50 years in PEI as well. So we're coming out of a very low flow period at that time. So I will emphasize as well that flow in August does not have a lot to do with rainfall in August. They are two distinctly different things. So we don't get much stream recharge in August from rainfall. So you can have good flow in August and poor rainfall, or you can have a lot of rainfall and poor flow. So it's the months preceding August that really dictate how much water is in a stream in August, and that's important. So flow measurement, so that's obviously the first thing to do if we're looking at a flows project. Unfortunately, the project was substantially delayed. The city was supposed to start pumping in about 2017. They had ongoing trouble with blowing up pumps for various reasons that they have now fixed. However, we did have a good period of pumping in about August of 2018, which allows us to use that month, and then by 2019 they really were able to start pumping continuously in earnest, so at roughly 80% of the permitted amount, which is the red line on the top is the permitted amount. So so how do we measure change in flow due to that pumping? Well, this is a simplistic method of showing you, but basically we need a baseline period, and we utilize the fact that any 2 adjacent watersheds are very closely linked in their flow pattern. So we looked at in 2016, 2017, comparing the Springvale branch to the lower Coles. That was our baseline period. We established the relationships that occur between those 2 branches then, and in 2018, 2019, when they're pumping, we're able to estimate what the deficit in flow from what we would expect in Coles Creek is. So, and it was about 31 or 38% based on this method, slightly lower with some other mathematical methods we have. So that's a considerable amount of flow reduction. So again, that's from expected. That is not the same as the provincial numbers, which look at the change from the median monthly flow. But unfortunately, flows have been so low that flows can be below the provincial criteria just naturally without any pumping, and quite often are, giving the variability of flow in PEI streams. So we know we are able to measure a considerable deficit in flow due to pumping, which of course is no great surprise to anybody. So temperature is also very important. We're measuring a temperature profile from one end of that stream to the other with various temperature loggers, most importantly in July and August, because our main fish is brook trout. Brook trout get very uncomfortable when it reaches 20 degrees Celsius and quite stressed. So at 24 degrees Celsius, they die. So that's our major fish species in most PEI streams. So temperature is of great consideration. We did see in 2018 that when they were pumping in August, we had a slight transition in temperature in the lower part of the stream, probably about a degree Celsius warmer due to pumping. That's quite understandable. This is contrary to many streams in the world. This is a cooling stream because the upper watershed is somewhat deteriorated due to land use and lack of treed buffer areas, so it's quite warm. And actually all the springs as you go down the stream tend to cool the stream as you go down. So any reduction in spring flow as you go downstream is going to change temperature as well in the system. So, and we certainly have evidence that between our upper and lower Coles flow monitoring stations in 2018, 2019, there is almost no water input during those years of pumping. So it would be understandable that we would get a slight upward transition in pumping, but we only have that to 2018. We haven't done any more recent analysis of that temperature trend yet. So the question is always, yes, but how is climate going to affect that? It's been mentioned several times in the transcripts as well. So what we have actually done, my colleague at INRS, Andre, has done, he's a water flow and temperature modeler. So he's created a model based on the Wilmot River. So this model basically takes 50 years of data. It learns from that data what things like rainfall and temperatures affect flow and temperature. So it's like a machine learning. It creates a model that understands what influences the stream. And then we apply the climate models to that to look forward as to what would happen. So, well, what will happen to flow? Two scenarios, a bad one and the worst one, so which you're probably familiar with, RCP 4.5 and 8.5. In any scenario, the median flow in the Wilmot River increases in either a 50-year or 100-year climate scenario in the August and September or low flow months. So we actually have more flow predicted in the streams in those summer months. So in terms of climate change competing with water use, we don't have to worry too much about that being a major factor. So why would that happen? Because the winters are actually warmer, which is of concern, but however, there's more recharge in the system because of the warmer winters. So, however, the model also did show with the 95 percentile, which is lower, that in fact the variability in summer stream flow is probably higher, even though the median is about the same. What happens with temperature? Well, not a heck of a lot, really. This doesn't show it, but the current August period temperature averages around 15 degrees Celsius. So in the most benign scenario of in the next 50 years with RCP 4.5, there's virtually no temperature difference. So worst case scenario in 100 years with the absolute worst climate scenario, we're going up to a mean temperature, which is represented by the line on these graphs of about just under 17 degrees Celsius. So worst case scenario in 100 years, 2 degrees Celsius. Which from the point of view of a brook trout is not too terrible, really. So we don't see in 100 years that we're going to be losing brook trout in our streams due to a temperature scenario. So, and that's the worst possible case scenario for temperature. In terms of biological monitoring, I'm not going to tell you about a lot of results because there aren't any that really show the effect of pumping yet, to be honest with you. But I'll tell you a little bit about what we are doing. We're looking at spawning reds up and down that system and have done so since 2016. So those are where the brook trout lay their eggs in the gravel. So we do surveys every year. In fact, 2019 we found 63 reds, which is quite outstanding for that size of stream, which is the most we've seen in any other year. So no evidence of a decline. We do annual fall electrofishing surveys to look at fish numbers in the system. So we have seen some declines in the lowest part of the stream. But they started before pumping started, and they're also concomitant with increases in rainbow trout. So we have other things going on there with an invasive species that's increasing. So fish tracking. fishing, so we're looking at our fish moving in response to flow and temperature in the system, and again, we don't have much results there, and that's focused on summertime when it's the warmest, so we can see if fish are behaviorally responding to increased temperature. So, and finally, modeling, doing habitat simulations. So if the flow was changed by X, Y, or Z, what would be the loss of habitat in the system? So we can apply this to other systems, other species, and not all field experiments are going to show an effect. So we can determine using our models where an effect might actually occur. So again, we've been working since 2016 and we're contracted to continue that to next March. We have proposed, it's not been confirmed, an additional 3 years of the study for Coles Creek, so in which we would try and pump more to see at what point we actually do see biological effects. So groundwater issues, so this is something that's not incorporated in the Coles Creek project because the provincial hydrogeologist is doing it. Can groundwater models predict the impact of groundwater extraction on water and stream levels? Well, the answer to that is somewhat yes already because we use them. So, however, it's something we want to look at carefully across PEI. So basically, with water extraction from the ground, there's no way in any given well to predict what the change is going to be from in the stream other than with models. So not all the water you're pumping out of the ground is going to end up in the stream. That's going to be highly variable depending on where your well is. So every pumping activity basically has a cone of depression where you're pulling down the water table, and we will actually use monitoring wells to measure the drawdown in varying distances to calibrate different models. So the scientific issue being that groundwater models are designed for homogeneous porous groundwater situations. We clearly don't have that on PEI because we have a very complex stratified fractured sandstone with all kinds of movement between different strata and layers as well as horizontally. So it's very complicated, though the existing models do seem to work reasonably well as we know so far. So the big question for PEI is nutrients and irrigation. So nitrogen loss from soils is the highest impact environmental issue in PEI, in my opinion, with dozens of estuaries going anoxic each year. So substantive reductions are required in some watersheds in the order of 50 to 70% nutrient reduction. So we really need to take a large step change in some areas to bring down the level of nutrients to where this does not happen anymore. So the question with regard to irrigation is, can fertigation improve the efficiency of nutrient uptake by the potato plant, thereby leading to reduced nutrient application rates and less leaching to groundwater? So this will be done largely on a different scale from the soil to groundwater level. So the potato plant, of course, uses 80% of its nutrients in the middle part of its growth cycle. So we, of course, give nutrients to the plant sometimes in the furrow as granular before the plant even needs it, which poses great risk for losing those nutrients to groundwater rather than having them go to the plant where the farmer wants to pay their money for them to go. So clearly by changing with fertigation or fertilizing through irrigation, we're able to change when and how much nutrients we give the plant so that more of the nutrient goes to the potato. So added to the fact the potatoes don't take up nutrients in dry soil. So the water enhances the uptake of nutrients. So there's huge potential to get massive reductions in our use of nutrients through the judicial use of water on the potato plant. So there are also a variety of techniques to measure that flux into the groundwater as well that we will be using. So because we're using essentially whole farms here, we're on quite a large scale, we should be able to, through either tile drains or monitoring wells, measure changes of the flux of nutrients to groundwater due to improved farming practices. So currently, there are 3 confirmed participating potato producers. 2 are contract producers. 1 is a table stock producer. There's also 1 potential non-potato row crop producer. So, of course, water is not only important to potatoes, it's important to all plants and to all farmers in terms of their productivity. So they vary. The sites we've chosen vary from quite low in the watershed near salt water to sometimes the highest spot, near the highest spot on the island. Although that site has gone, we did have 1 additional producer who has chosen to build himself some ponds and fill them from low-capacity wells because he wasn't willing to wait any longer to irrigate his crops. So we also have a big geographical distribution. Much work on groundwater and PEI has been done in the central region of PEI. While we look fairly homogeneous geologically, there are some quite big differences across the island in terms of the geology, so it's important to know how those geographic differences might influence our findings as well. So. Financial logistics, so again, going back to the Natural Sciences Engineering Council, it's called an alliance grant, so under the newly minted NSERC partnership program, which takes up a large part of their research budget, it's a cash leverage only program, so somebody must be bringing money to the table, a partner, for you to apply for matching government money. So in their words, alliance grants encourage university researchers to collaborate with partner organizations, which can be from private, public, or non-for-profit sectors, which is a big difference in this current program. So we couldn't leverage government money before this program. These grants support research projects led by strong, complementary, collaborative teams that will generate new knowledge and accelerate the application of research results to create benefits for Canada. And we'd like to think the project we're proposing fits well within those descriptions. So NSERC projects, by the way, are always assessed scientifically on 3 criteria: the strength of the proposal, the excellence of the research team, and the potential to train high-quality research personnel and graduate students in this particular thing, which should never be understated either as part of what we do at universities. So. There's been a lot of talk about project management of such a controversial and high-profile project. It has certainly been suggested that there be an oversight or governance board, which would be led by and comprised of respected community or partner individuals, and then that oversight board might have a communications role. So there is, of course, the scientific team, which supervises the graduate students and undergraduates and is primarily responsible for what science we're doing. But there would also be a technical committee to advise both the scientific team and the governance board, which will be more technically knowledgeable individuals from other partner organizations. As my last word, so what happens when this research is all done is the question that's been brought up by many people, and the answer is, I don't know. So there obviously will be a decision on high-capacity wells at some point in the future for agricultural irrigation will probably have to be made as a result of this research. Who's going to make those decisions? Presumably people like you, but there's been question about whether there should be an arm's length water governing body on PEI as well to assist with making such decisions. So this was a slide that I presented the picture early on in the Water Act. In fact, I was invited by the province to do the initial talk for the consultation, first consultations to the Water Act in Charlottetown, and I said at that time that the Water Act is the tip of the iceberg. It's the principles and processes by which we will manage water. So we really get into the nuts and bolts things with the regulations, which you're discussing here, and again, that is just the start, really. So there's a whole lot of things in the Water Act that haven't been entirely explored that I think are great things. But it's going to be 5 years of work even after proclamation of the Water Act to really think things going. So the Water Act enshrines water management plans. Well, who's going to be tasked with those? What will those regions be? What will they consider? And important to this subject is, can they vary between water management areas? Could you allow agricultural irrigation from high capacity wells in one area and say in another area, saying where you want it to protect Atlantic salmon, could you absolutely prohibit it in another area? And the answer is you probably could. So it may not be one size fits all necessarily, or it doesn't have to be in terms of that final decision. So I'll end there and just slightly over time, sorry.
That's fine. All right, we'll go to questions. Lynn, you're first on my list.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you for your presentation today. I certainly appreciate it. I'm sure we all do. You said something that caught my ear, and I need to unpack this with you a little bit. You had indicated that in the worst case climate scenario models, you are seeing the maximum increase of stream temperature of 2 degrees.
Yeah. In 100 years, yes.
In 100 years.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I have gone through the IPCC research on this, and they are indicating that the worst case climate scenarios are a 4.8 degree global average temperature increase. That's astronomical. I would love to know what you are deeming the worst case climate scenarios.
Well, again, that's a global average, so of course I am not a climate expert, but I have had a number of dealings with it and done a lot of personal reading. So there are areas that are worse than other areas. So our temperature is quite regulated by the sea because we're near the sea. So in interior continental areas, there are much more extremes of climate. So or in polar areas. So but ours would probably be on the lower end of what the global temperature change would be. So this is also the August stream temperature. In fact, the water temperatures in the wintertime did actually show a 4-degree change. So can I answer why it would be less in the summertime? No, I don't think I can really. So, but that's what the models show. Again, all models are wrong and some are useful. To me, a model is a hypothesis. So if I can measure it and it happens, then it's real. So other than that, a model is just a hypothesis. This is a model based on a model, by the way, and the global climate change models do not consider a lot of things. They do not consider the regulating effect of the greening of the planet, which has been published in some of the highest quality journals in the world as well, because carbon dioxide is a fertilizer. So, and plants grow more, and NASA has published studies in Science how we can see this from space happening already. So one has to be careful with models that we're talking about hypotheses here. So.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So the IPCC collection of data has climate scientists from all over the world, and these are negotiated models that have come forward. This is a review of all of the data that exists, and these are negotiated agreements, what is produced in the IPCC report. Are you saying you disagree with what the IPCC is predicting?
I'm saying anything that comes from a model is a hypothesis. So I think it's a good one. I neither agree nor disagree with it, but we should not accept it as truth because models are wrong. It might be worse, it might be better. I don't know. So, but we need to be cautious that we are talking about models here, projections. So.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I completely agree with you. And actually, every climate model I've ever seen has actually demonstrated in time that the scenario is significantly worse than we had previously anticipated it would be. Original models had said around the year 2000, I believe, the ice caps would begin to melt, and we obviously have discovered it's significantly worse than that, for sure. So an interesting point you made was that in winter there is potential in worst case scenarios, based on the worst case scenarios that you are plugging in, a 4-degree impact on temperature in the winter. What sort of implications would that have on habitat?
Well, it has a huge implication because fish will die of cold. I realize that sounds somewhat silly, but actually the warmer winter temperatures will cause many more of these thaws that we see. We get a whole bunch of snow, then we get a sudden thaw. What happens to the stream temperature during that period? It actually plummets to 0 degrees Celsius. So because all this water is coming down and all the snow, it's just like adding ice to your drink. So, and we can get things like ice on top of spawning red. So there is no model that will predict that detail of effect yet. I've talked to all the modelers. It's like, yeah, but the model show no model will show that yet. So again, that could be very significant for our fish and fish population. So what's happening in the wintertime when the eggs are often in the gravel can be much more important than what's happening in the summertime.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Yes, I agree with that. I think one of the challenges with climate change is that there are implications that show up in all kinds of areas that we aren't always looking at. And it's really easy for us to talk about stream flow in August and feel good to hear that the increase in available water in August will likely be there. But we actually know that there's probably all kinds of implications in the winter and in different months that could have profound impacts. I find it Another comment you had made earlier is that a 70% stream flow is sort of the baseline. When I'm looking on the government's website, it lists 80% as the baseline that we...
So to characterize the federal government guidelines that has come out through a CSAS process through DFO, or that if you have a 10% flow reduction you have little chance of effects. 20% you have a moderate chance of effects, and a 30% flow reduction, you have a pretty good chance of effect. So we're not on the overly cautious end with regard to our flow reduction. So on that, so I'm not. So you're talking of the provincial government site. So it's something I was not aware of. If it's
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. When I'm looking on the princeofrhodeisland.ca website, it says water withdrawal in PEI streams. The next challenge for stream ecologists worldwide is determining the critical minimum habitat for fish and other species. The immediate question for stream biologists on PEI from our studies remains, is a 20% loss of habitat biologically significant? The general opinion of fish ecologists is that 80% of flow must remain after flow.
Well, I would actually agree that I would like to see 80% remain. So yes. So whether that is a critical loss of habitat in PEI and where that is has yet to be determined yet. Again, we've seen 2 years of 30% flow reductions in Coles Creek, and we've yet to be able to find a difference in spawning red oarfish density. So maybe we're not looking at the right things. We're trying to, but so where that is with regard to PEI specifically is why we did this project. So, but I think as a good precautionary guideline, I think 20% is a good number. I agree totally with it. So.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. When I was researching for this presentation, I was surprised at how little data I could find on island streams and waterways broadly. Could you give me a sense of what percentage of island waterways we already have baseline data on?
Well, we have, so the Hydrographic Service has data for 6 major rivers. One I didn't include because it's the Winter River, so in that diagram, so we can never trust it as a baseline particularly. So we have smatterings of flow measurements going back to the 1920s for a few years here and there for many other systems, but that's about all there is. So yeah, good baseline data is always a challenge with regard to projects like this, which is why we're trying to honestly develop methods that don't require as much baseline data, because in a management scenario, we're not always going to have that data, let alone a research scenario.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I was really surprised 6 rivers is a remarkably low amount of test points, especially considering that each river and waterway and estuary is its own ecosystem. They do not necessarily respond in the same way. It depends on environmental factors, it depends on the location, it depends on all kinds of things if we're talking about stream health, not just flow, but the stream health. And there's a remarkable absence of that baseline data as it is. Doesn't it seem like a challenge to try to get an idea of the impacts of extraction when we don't know the baselines that we're starting from in almost any parts of the province to begin with?
It is a challenge, and those numbers are actually quite high regarding with respect to the amount of land area in PEI. In fact, there's 8 now because of the there's also the Winter River and the Barber Waite River 9 actually, because Coles Creek as well. So there's an additional station there. The whole north shore of Nova Scotia and New Brunswick does not have 9 flow monitoring stations. So we have a pretty good intensity of them, and the Hydrographic Service does a very good job. It takes $50,000 to $100,000 minimum to set up one of those stations, and $50,000 a year to run one as the government does it. So of course our research stations were running for a fraction of the cost of that, but we can't continue that for 50 years either. So it's an expensive proposition, and we get as good a data just about as you can expect anywhere in the world, I think. So from that.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. But it gives us very little understanding of where we were starting from. If we're trying to talk about the impact of extraction on a particular watershed or stream, estuary, etc., if we don't have, I understand that it's expensive to set it up, but if we don't have baseline data to begin with, it's very hard to conclusively say what the impacts are. Would you agree?
Again, there are ways and means to model these things too. So as we're doing in this scenario, because we know there's a very close relationship between 2 adjacent streams. They have the same conditions from year to year. So we can, with a fairly great deal of certainty, model what we would expect the flow to be in a system that is adjacent to another system. The further away geographically, if you look at the Bear River and the Mill River, so they're not very well linked to each other, but the closer they are, the more certainty we can do that with. So.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. And yes, I understand we can do modeling, and I agree with something you said earlier. Modeling is often wrong. And is it reliable? Sometimes. But from the perspective of whether or not it's going to give us clear information, if we don't already have a baseline established, my point is that I think the most we can get is a good guess.
And this is, of course, models, depending on, the more simplistic they are, the more, this is a y equals mx plus b sort of model. So where you have one variable related to another variable. A global climate model, contains 1,000 variables, I would say, probably. So very much more complex, very much more uncertainty. Models have uncertainties too. We're always uncertain about models, but some have 10% uncertainty, and, a global climate model, how much uncertainty do we have? 50 to 100% probably with the different scenarios, right? So there's a difference in the uncertainty that goes with models. So, and this one is pretty good, and we have no choice but to regulate based on some mathematical extrapolation of what we do know to what we don't know. So.
Lynn?
I have lots of questions for you, but I will let some of my colleagues ask them first. You can come back to me.
Robert?
Yeah, thanks, Dr. Van Heuvel. Once again, I guess the first thing I wanted to comment, you look like you're simulating a very great team there of very credible scientists and to move forward with this study. But I just want to get a few questions here just regarding maybe other jurisdictions and comparable. Do you know of other jurisdictions that are allowing supplemental irrigation and still have a very sustainable groundwater levels, or have done some sense of research to determine what the flow rates would be and things of that? That would be somewhat comparable to PEI, I guess, because in my understanding, PEI is probably one of the few jurisdictions that actually has a moratorium or doesn't permit.
Well, there's a couple of questions there. Again, and certainly my colleague from the Federation of Agriculture could speak better to those points as well. But certainly in Western North America, there's not an acre of potatoes that is not irrigated from somewhere. So there are not many jurisdictions that do not irrigate potatoes for a variety of reasons. So there are not that many similar areas with regard to groundwater and the nature of how much water comes from groundwater. So in Alberta, they would irrigate potatoes by extracting from the surface. So we certainly probably have an advantage here in terms of extracting from groundwater because, A, it doesn't impact fishes directly by having a pump in the water, which can have a substantial effect on killing things. So, and secondly, not all of that water that we're pumping out of the ground is going to make it from the stream. If you pump from the stream, you will inherently have less water available for irrigation if you want to protect your stream. So, so there are some advantages to that, but it's relatively unique. The only other area of Canada with regard to drinking water that takes as much from groundwater is around the sort of Waterloo, Kitchener-Waterloo area is the highest really. So, but there are no other areas of Canada because of the geology that are comparable with regard to the amount of groundwater and the ease with which groundwater can be extracted. So.
Rob?
Sorry, just on that answer, you mentioned a little bit about that other places do holding ponds and some things of that nature. Now, I've been of the opinion that that's probably a poorer way to irrigate and have more impact on the environment and better or less use of our water resources than high-capacity wells would have. Do you you're basically agreeing with that in general terms?
Well, this is all a matter of degree. It's economics versus environmental protection. So there will be years based on a 70% Q50, so where the flow is just already low without pumping, and you may have to shut down any irrigation period. They do it with surface water extraction in the Dunk River already. That is a quite reasonable thing to do. So it stands to reason if the ponds do not necessarily preclude high capacity wells. So you could have a high capacity well to fill ponds, and in the event that your irrigation is shut down, you could have those ponds as a backup for 1 week, 2 weeks, 3 weeks for that worst period of the summer when the plant needs the water most, when the stream needs the water the most. So so I think ponds are a necessary consideration in the equations. Economically, you can put in a high-capacity well and pump irrigation water. That is the cheapest way to do it because you don't have to build a pond and the infrastructure that goes along with that. So, so yes, ponds are critical part of the question, really. So if there are going to be periods when irrigation is going to be shut down and based just on flows alone, that will happen. That has to happen, even at 30% of your median flow. So ponds are going to have to be a consideration.
Rob?
Just on that slide there, actually talk about when the research is done, but it also reflects a little bit on this decision on who makes a decision when to either not extract water from either high capacity well or from ponds. And you mentioned there about an arm's length governing body of some capacity. Are you talking something like we form like a water authority, or should this something be done through the Department of Environment, or should it be at, they'll say, the Watershed Alliance? What sort of you suggesting when you talk about an arm's length?
Yeah, that's just a thought with regard to the transparency of making water decisions and the public trust in making water decisions on PEI. Whether you know, I mean, we have an IRAC that makes regulatory decisions on a whole bunch of things. So why not have something similar for water? So certainly, I'm not in any way taking away from the ability of the civil service people I respect greatly in Prince Edward Island to make those decisions. They are already making those decisions very well. They already know when a watershed is being pushed, you know, and can turn down permits regarding that. So we would have had trouble with the producer in the Dunk River anyways, because it's already saturated with surface water permits. So there is a finite amount of water. So, you know, the winter river would never happen again in this day and age, where we suck half a watershed dry, literally. So, and we have drying upstream. So because it would not be allowed. So we have already reached sort of a new level on this that is currently existing. I'm not saying we necessarily need anything new. So I think it's more of a public transparency and trust issue than it is with regard to a environmental safety issue. So,
Rob?
So when you're, so in the past, we have currently a moratorium only on agricultural irrigation. The research and the work that you're doing is really about the extraction of high capacity oil. It's irrelevant to what its usage would be, correct? And so what would be the science that's there that says that there should be a moratorium specifically on agricultural irrigation?
there is, of course, none. That's a social decision.
Yeah,
So,
exactly.
so.
Kind of thought.
Rob?
On that.
And related to that, I mean, there is a difference too, because supplemental irrigation, you know, is 2 weeks, 2 months, I don't know, during a year period, not 365 days a year. So in a scientific scenario, that's quite different. It just happens to be at the time when the stream also needs the water the most. So, and that's what we have to look at. So.
Rob?
I know you're looking at having also watershed groups as part of your partners that you're looking at in doing some of this particular research. I'm assuming from that you have a lot of faith in our watershed groups, our Watershed Alliance, and you think that they should be playing any role on an individual basis within a watershed, or should it be a larger group that that's playing a role? So I guess where I'm coming from is that you've got 3 or 4 different locations that you're looking at doing some of the research on. Would it be your partners within the watershed groups, would they be specific to, say, West Point is the one I'm looking at for the one on the Pierre-Jacques River, or you're looking at a bigger group of Watershed Alliance members?
Well, certainly on the groundwork will take case in the location, so those watershed groups are more important. With regard to the Watershed Alliance as a whole, we will always continue to work with them. I think myself or a student presents to them probably once a year, and we're working with other watersheds on other things, and they are already partners in other projects that we have. So so there will be on communication involvement there, and there's also opportunity for their involvement on the various boards, you know, particularly the oversight board as well. So so which they may be interested in. So.
Rob?
Yeah, no, and I support that in the respect that the watershed groups or the Watershed Alliance should be basing most of their decisions as much on science as any organization that's out there, and I think that's the key on that. I guess my final question that I'll add, you know, when it comes back to the fertigation issue, and I think that's one of the things that I'll have concerns about at the moment, where we have a situation where we have very dry conditions. Farmers are doing a lot to try to keep their potatoes alive, try to keep them there for when rain may come, and that usually encompasses a fair bit of fertilization to try to keep them there. That's going to be a fairly significant risk that happens as we move forward. So to me, your comments there about the fertigation and the maximizing of the fertilizer that's put in the ground into the plant and leaving less and less to be at risk for runoff and things of that nature, which in my opinion is a greater environmental risk than the extraction of water. So I really commend you for that comment, I guess, and including that in your as part of the equation in this, because like I say, there's always risks that we're faced in everything that we do in life. Farmers are included in that. They have to try to be sustainable, they have to be profitable, and they have to take what's given to them in situations with environment like dry conditions. It may not always be in the best interest. So if we can allow those farmers the tools to utilize all their investments, fertilization, I think fertilization and things of that nature is going to reduce the overall environmental risks in time. So I comment that if you want to add a comment to that, I'd appreciate it. But,
Yeah, well, I will comment that in terms of agronomy, I'm a water fish person. I am a relative neophyte, but I have had my eyes open in the last few years regarding the nature of precision agriculture in general, and I guess to be frank, how far behind we are on PEI regarding that, and what technology can happen. And I think certainly the farmers I've talked to are grasping that technology. They all walk around with their iPhones connected to various sensors in their fields and stuff like that. Now we have a new generation of quite technologically advanced farmers, and there's huge potential here to benefit both the farmer and the environment. As utopian as that might sound coming from me, I am excited by that potential genuinely. So I mean, nutrients cost money too, right? So if we can use less and get more out of our crop and benefit the environment and benefit the farmer, as long as we can do it safely with regards to our water use, and that's what this is about, why not do it? So,
music to my ears. Thanks. That's it for me, Chair.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Can we go back to the slide that had the list of partners that would be involved?
or which slide? Or the partners?
Near the beginning of how many partners? There we are. Yeah. Okay, so the desire to have industry opinions out of the process is exactly what Islanders want to see. You referred to it as public trust. They just want to make sure that the process is scientific and that we have good solid data free from opinions. And something else that you had mentioned, that the partner opinions would be taken seriously as part of the study that you'd be taking on here. And I realize that there is a formula for federal funding that kind of asks for that, but the public is asking for something else. And so if indeed we do have to have these industry partners in there, I'm wondering is this a complete list, or would you be reaching out to more organizations such as the NFU, organic producers, the Fishers Association?
These would be the ones that would be on the grant as being the partners. So in the Federation of Agriculture, obviously, so you're talking about industrial partners, has the broadest representation of farmers on all Prince Edward Island. So naturally, they were the ones. They do have members that they represent from all aspects of the industry and all companies, which will be involved. So, but I mean, you did mention something that I need to comment on, that you know, with regard to science without opinions. There is no such thing as science without opinions. So I have opinions, you have opinions, scientists have opinions and perspectives. So we try as scientists to take out opinion as much as possible and let the data tell us what's going on. So, but that exists. So I've worked with multiple industries, oil sands, pulp and paper, sometimes successfully, sometimes not successfully. So there is always this perception that you're being influenced by the industry. So I can tell you a lot of people in the potato industry don't like me very much because of what I had said. So, which is part of the reason that they want to work with me, because they think that I can be trusted. So, because I will say bad things about them if there are bad things to say. So we all have opinions, we all have perspectives. So, but I've generally found it a good process, because I can show you a piece of data and you can have a perspective on it and I can have a perspective. And an industry person, the data doesn't change. It is hard numbers, it's hard science, but we all have perspectives on those things that are equally valid. So to each other, and as a society, we must balance those perspectives to make decisions. So we cannot exclude anybody as partners or their perspective from the overall. You know, the science has to be trusted by everybody. Everybody's got to have their say. At the end of the day, I will still be the one who comes out and says, I think this is what the data is showing when I have considered everybody's perspectives.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So this is not a complete list of partners, but this is just who will be on the application. Every other entity?
So formally, it is a complete list of partners, because this will be official. So as these are the partners that, in it, so.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So we're missing some perspectives on this and some opinions that could bring some of that trust in the data, that all of the perspectives have been considered and there's not one larger opinion being weighed heavier or having more influence than another opinion might have. Because scientifically every opinion is valid, but industry-wise some opinions are louder than others.
There's always, yes, you're absolutely right, and there's always going to be opinions, and there will be, and I could show that, we can take 30% of stream flow quite safely for the next 100 years, and there will still people who have opinions that say we don't want high-capacity wells, period. That will be their opinion, right? So I could say we need to get down to only taking 10% of stream flow, and there will be a large people that have opinions, including all the municipalities that will be way out of compliance in their water usage that are going to have opinions in the other direction as well. So yes, everybody will have opinions. So we have to try and present the science in the most balanced way possible, considering those opinions. And people will still disagree with decisions based on science, just on their values and perspectives. And that's all right, because that's why we have a society with different opinions that considers all those opinions.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So last week we had a marine biologist in here indicating that we have years of work to do to gather solid baseline data to know about anoxic events and whatnot that are going across in our estuaries and things like that across PEI. And we also heard from you that there's no place like PEI, so we don't really have a good set of data that we can take from somewhere else to start with. We have to create our own solid baseline data. So just as a process, we, number one, want solid baseline data. And I was wondering, how long do you think it would take for us to gather that here on Prince Edward Island before we had confidence that while 9 places might be fine, another 2 are not?
Well, a couple things there. That sounds a bit like, well, we don't have all the data yet, so we can't do it. So you never have all the data. You never will have all the data. So decisions are made based on the best available data. We have a lot of baseline data now. There were also some inaccuracies in that previous testimony. They said anoxic events are only reported. There's no monitoring. I had a PhD student that worked for 5 years on how we're going to monitor anoxia in PEI estuaries. It's been implemented by the province of PEI and in New Brunswick and Nova Scotia by the Department of Fisheries and Oceans. So we're gathering a ton of baseline data. We have models relating tidal flushing and nutrients to anoxia. We have models that show how much we have to reduce the nutrients by in order to get to the period where we no longer have anoxia. So there is a ton of baseline data out there. We know more about PEI streams collectively and in a detailed fashion than anywhere else in Canada due to our fairly constrained geographical nature and the fact that we can go out and study them so easily. So no, it's not waiting and see because we don't have the baseline data just doesn't cut it. So and we're proposing to do research anyways to collect more baseline data. So and more data on this. So and we're at the point where we have to do that. So saying there's not enough baseline data, nobody's going to pay me to go out and collect baseline data or anybody to collect baseline data. So people, you don't get research funding to collect baseline data, and nobody else is going to do it. So now is the time to do it through this research project and move forward with this. So let's look at it and let's look at the science and let's make the decisions based on the science. So.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So you feel like we have enough data to get started here and we'll gather more through the process?
Unquestionably.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So what happens during this process if negative impacts do arise during this, I'm going to call it a pilot project that we have going here, the study project? Would the study end and damage mitigation measures begin immediately? What's the plan if negative impacts occur during
Well, it
the...
hasn't been entirely considered. I mean, we have to accept that we're doing stuff that may cause negative impacts. You know, we do it, for example, in the experimental lakes area in Ontario, which, you know, when the federal government cut funding to that, and even though it causes negative impacts, there was great public outcry. The reality is to have environmentally relevant science, we have to do it on a scale where we're sure whether we're going to see negative impacts or not. So then, yes, in essence, the science could have negative impacts, so we can measure them. It's for a short period of time, and you know, we wipe out whole streams with fish kills, right? So we know they can be mitigated. So we're not talking about impacts that are that severe even. So we're talking about far more subtle impacts than that. So yes, they can definitely be mitigated. So and they will come back. Actually, our reference site Springvale was actually knocked out by a fish kill in 2014. We're doing fish studies there now. You know, brook trout have come back there. So.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So when you say the damage can definitely be mitigated, we heard exactly the opposite last week, not exactly the opposite, but that as things start to slide towards, we were using a green, yellow, red scale, and if you don't catch the things early enough in the yellow and start changing and they slide to red, it's very difficult to bring that area back, speaking about estuaries, I do believe.
I think that was a generalization made by somebody who was talking about fisheries and fish populations, and there is some truth in that. So certainly we let the cod population slide too much, and it's not back yet. There's no question about that. So I don't see that being a scenario with brook trout, for example, in our streams, because to be honest with you, they have withstood everything we've thrown at them for 100 years, and they are still there for a very good reason. So will we cause a slide in a brook trout population in a stream? It's a potential thing that could happen as a result of the research. Will it be permanent and not come back? No. I mean, worst case scenario, we put more brook trout in, right? So to stock the system, we stock many of our systems. Many of our Atlantic salmon populations are entirely dependent on stocking. I wouldn't call them healthy, but we restock systems after fish kills too, but due to funding cuts, some of the hatchery efforts to keep broodstock to do that were cut, actually, so that we can't restock from the same genetics as easily anymore. So yes, we can mitigate. So it's not like a cod population, so where it's much larger geographic scale and harder to mitigate with many other factors. So.
Steve?
So you put more trout populations go down, you put more trout in, but I mean, there's an awful lot more species that are at play here than just a single trout and things like that. The species that those trout would rely on, I'm not so certain the answer is you can just dump some more fish in and that's suitable mitigation.
I mean, trout largely eat invertebrates, so there are Atlantic salmon, basically, and some stickleback, as well as introduced rainbow trout in our rivers, the odd eel, but those are the main species we have for fish. So there really aren't no more except in specific areas where there's rare cases, but they eat invertebrates largely, and invertebrates are the first ones to recolonize and come back, largely because they fly. So they can get to one stream to another themselves. They don't even need the help of being transplanted. So invertebrate populations have been shown to be extremely resilient. So in terms of returning very quickly to what they were before.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So your study, we have data, whether it's sufficient baseline data or not, but we start with our data, we move forward, and it's going to be some sort of flexible plan, I would hope, that recognizes if damage is being done and can stop or slow down and mitigate those damages quickly. Would we be using a precautionary approach or the precautionary principle in all things that we do here, considering how sensitive an issue it is for the public?
I've seen that word mentioned a lot of times in a lot of contexts. So I mean, I can adjust the precautionary principle. It was originally a scientific terminology, that says we will err on the side of of safety. So I think I've seen the definition of precautionary principle expanded a bit more than I would be comfortable for in its initial scientific meaning. But yes, of course, we'll always be precautionary. So my biggest concern actually is that with the pumping activity that we have, we're not actually going to be able to detect a change, and that I'll be spending a whole lot of people's money to not detect anything. Because we already know from the models that if we have one high-capacity well in a watershed with none others, you know, we would expect to not even change. So we have 5 in Coles Creek, we're changing the flow by 30%, right, in a small watershed. Well, you know, do the math. If we have 1 only operating for a month and a half at most, you know, we might see a 5% change in flow. You know, by all international and Canadian standards, as mentioned, that's actually not enough to see anything. So, so it's a concern to me scientifically that what are we getting out of it if we're doing a whole bunch of studies and not seeing anything at all, either other than the fact that we haven't seen anything. So it's not like streams are going to dry up and there's going to be huge effects that we're going to have to mitigate. So we're looking for pretty subtle things, and 4 years and we haven't seen them in Coles Creek yet. So I'm not saying they're not there, but there's certainly you know, more brook trout reds in 2019 than any other year we've seen. So so yeah, my worry is that you get a whole bunch of non-effect data, so not that we're going to have effects to mitigate. So,
Steve?
When you mentioned climate change and how it wasn't really a worry for water flows here on Prince Edward Island because temperature, sorry, not for water flows, but for the temperature in the estuaries and things like that and the rivers, will this study be considering the actual shift of rainfall patterns and worst case scenarios and precautionary principles in that regard as well?
you know, I think we have to put things in perspective with regards to climate change. I'm not diminishing it as a serious issue, so, but 2-degree temperature change, you know, if you gave me a couple $1 million and said go nuts in Coles Creek, I could make an improvement of 2 degrees temperature change in Coles Creek just by planting trees. I could do it right now, not in 50 years, not in 100 years. So why are we so worried about what's going to happen in 100 years when we can't fix the problems that we got right now that are fixable? So let's balance the focus between, you know, it almost seems like an avoidance of our present issues and the willingness to do something about them, that we're so damn worried about climate change, because, you know, it's nothing we can measure, it's in the future. Yes, we have to be concerned about it, but we have to put everything in context with, you know, we have issues with sediment, we have issues with pesticides, we have issues with nutrients. We can do those things to fix and repair those issues today. So let's start working on that, as well as worry about what the ramifications of what climate change are going to give us.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So in consideration of that, we can just deal with reality and what happened this year. Would we be using a year like this as our baseline moving forward for how much rainfall we could expect to get?
That's a good question, and I've actually been asking for some data from my colleagues as well about, I mean, I've seen a lot of talk about the rainfall projections, so without actually laying eyes on many people presenting data on that, and I want to see the data myself with regard to the climate projections. I mean, the total rainfall is not going to change very much in PEI is what's projected, but the timing will change. We know that. I'd like to see some of those numbers, and certainly there's some indication that's what we can expect, that we are going to have less rainfall in the summer. More of it will come in the winter time. So, but again, we're on the borderline here of, you know, the actual data is showing, you know, rainfall going in one direction and the climate projections in another direction the last time I saw it presented to me. So because we're so close to the border of having not much change in rainfall, that the uncertainties are very high. So, but there seems to be general agreement that we will have less, and there's been a number of people do climate reports that I've seen. There'll be less in summer and more through the winter period. So hence the reason for more recharge in the streams. So.
Steve?
Sorry, I didn't hear if you would be using the minimum or the precautionary approach of this year's, like we're going to have solid data from what our rainfall was this year that we could use moving forward, or would it be more?
Yes, but more to stream flow. So we also have low stream flow this year. So I want to be able to better understand what predicts low stream flow in a given year, because again, it's not predicted by August rainfall. It's predicted by, you know, rainfall, is it May or June, is it previous September? It's actually dependent on other years as well, because that level of recharge can be higher going into a year from the previous years as well. So it's a complicated scenario, and I want to be able to understand the worst case scenario, which is low flow years, you know, and how we should regulate in low flow years so that we are precautionary. Precautionary is saying we're having a low flow year, we know we're having a low flow year, that we know irrigation. That is precautionary for sure. So, and I fully agree with that, so.
Steve, you good for now? Darlene?
Thank you, Chair, and thanks very much, Michael, for coming in. It's always great to hear you speak, and I want to say I was very impressed with the scientists you've got on board. I think it's important, and as interesting as global and worldwide studies are, I think government here and everyone in this room should be more concerned about what's happening here in PEI than, and I want to thank you for the information that you've got regarding that. We talk about this project and deep water wells or high capacity wells. We have some here in PEI now. Why do we need to drill new ones for the project? Can you give me a little information on that?
So, sorry, was that? I didn't hear you.
Darlene?
I said, we have some high capacity wells here in
Yep.
PEI now. Why do we need to drill some new ones for this particular project that we're looking at?
Well, what your colleagues were talking about, baseline data. How can you have baseline data for somewhere where you've already been pumping out of? So it's simply impossible to do a study. So we have particularly the site up west. There is the nearest high capacity well is a long way away in O'Leary, so there's very little wells or pumping or activity. So we are more confident of getting good baseline data before we're pumping. It's absolutely essential to any study of this nature. So.
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. Governments have kicked this down the road, this issue now for, I think, 18 years, and it's a very emotional issue for a number of people, but I know we've discussed it in our caucus and in our cabinet about we want this to be based on science, and I think that's really important. So that being the case, with these 4 new wells, should government maybe own them or manage them, or would that be a way of making it a more, unbiased study in any way?
That has been discussed within the whole of the government and other places, I think. So it was even discussed that the university should own them. So, and that would have caused me probably a year of headaches. So, and legal assessment and liabilities, and so I'm glad we're not going in that direction. So, but they are on the farmer's land. I do think it reasonable that the farmer own them. So the government will permit them. After the exploratory permit, there would have to be a water use permit. The government controls those permits. So the government controls that well and that pumping, and if they say you have to put concrete down it in 5 years after the research, that's what has to be done if that's what the permit says. So ultimately it is government that has entire control over what is done with that well, even though the farmer owns it and it is on their land, so as I see it.
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. So maybe government should manage the well, or and then when the project is finished, government decides what happens with the well. Just because we are drilling 4 new high-capacity wells for this project, and what the ramifications are regarding that.
Yeah, that's right, and certainly you can't forecast the decision and put that in your permit. So the permit would again simply have to say the well is for the purposes of research only, and at such time as there is no more research, the permit is invalid. So it cannot be used to extract water unless there is research going on at the site. So you will have to qualify that, of course, too. But that seems to me to be the way to do it. So that. As soon as the research ends, that well could not be used, and again, pending a decision on this issue as a whole, which might be 2, 3, 5 years down the road. We don't know. So,
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. Well, government wants to deal with this. I mean, it's something that's been going on way too long, and I think it's been an unfair slant to farmers. We need to have agriculture here in the province, and we have to do it in a way that is science-based and fact-driven. And there's not a farmer that I know who does not want to do what's right for the land, and maybe need help with that. But I think through this study that we'll get that help. As far as the amount of nitrates that are running off, do you have any information on irrigation and how that could affect or lessen the amount of nitrate that runs off? Because that's something I've heard is because you have irrigation and you're watering, when you apply the fertilizer, that it's more liable to, absorb into the ground versus runoff?
There is a lot of information out there. Do I have it at the tip of my fingers? No. So there's certainly a lot of information, tons of information out there about potatoes and how they take up nutrients and how much nutrients they need. And some of that is less easy to access, so it's probably contained within the industry itself as well, unfortunately. And we'd like to see all this sort of information become transparent. And in the PEI situation, we'd like that part of the research project to be transparent too. I haven't mentioned, and we're not proposing that we would be the ones to measure potato productivity, but it could be part of the soil level studies as well. These are important questions that could be encompassed by this or related studies. So because we're going to have the opportunity there, if we're going to do this, to actually measure this ourselves here on PEI in a credible way that hopefully everybody can trust at the end of the day. Because if we don't get an increase in productivity by doing this, there's no point somebody putting $250,000 into infrastructure for water if there isn't a great financial benefit. So the economics will have to be known of doing this as well. So, and we've discussed having economics as part of this as well, but at some point it just gets too big. It's big already, so it's huge. So those things will all have to be considered. So,
Darlene?
So I'm just wondering, with the wells that are being drilled, are we looking at other crops besides potatoes? I know there was talk about a possibility of another well, or the fourth well being for a different crop, and I know part of the 2020 budget, which was requested basically, I think, by the opposition, that we there's funding to look at diversity of crops and how that would be affected, how it will change the landscape of PEI, and I think what that will do for the environment. And so if we're going to do high capacity wells, we look at, it's going to be carrots or coal crops or something else and what they need for irrigation. I think it's important that this is a holistic approach. Like if we're going to grant a permit for a high capacity well, we have to look at, the crop rotation, the nutrients in the soil, all the best practices that a farmer would use, and any permit is hinged on, all of those best practices. I'm not sure how that is going to happen, but I think it's really important that that's part of it. So I'm just wondering if you can comment on whether one of those wells is going to be irrigating something other than potatoes.
yeah, well, it's proposed at this point in time, so there's been no acceptance or certainty, and I won't mention anything about who it would be or anything further because of that. So, but we certainly think it's an excellent idea. Water is not just important to potatoes. The reality is, and again, my colleague next can speak to this better, but there have been potential. I'm a firm believer in diversification of agriculture and PEI, so I don't think potatoes should go away. I'm not saying that. They will always be an important part and a profitable part of farming operations, but diversification is always important, whether it's your financial portfolio or agriculture. So diversification is something that should be achieved. And water is important to any other types of crops that are not here yet that may consider coming in. The availability of water is always going to be a question. So yes, I think it's of critical importance that we have a non-potato crop included in there. So, and while non-potato crops are thought to be somewhat less intensive with regard to the amount of nutrient, they still do use nutrients and fertilizer as well. So it spawns a whole lot of interesting research questions as well. So,
Lynn?
Back to something you had said earlier, you, in response to a question from my colleague, you had asked why are we so, I believe you said, damn concerned about climate change when this is going to impact us 100 years from now. But I would just love to reiterate that scientists all over the world have been screaming that this is not a problem that's just going to impact us 100 years from now. We're seeing implications from climate change now, and I think if you spoke to any farmer this summer, they would tell you that they are seeing the implications of climate change now. So I think talking about it as if this is a problem that's going to impact us 100 years from now, we don't need to take it into consideration when we are making decisions today, is just entirely inaccurate. One of the things that is so important, the answers that we find are directly related to the questions that we are asking. And I was wondering if you could expand on what question we're trying to answer with this study specifically.
First of all, let me say that I wasn't saying that we shouldn't be concerned about climate change or what's going to happen in 100 years. Of course we should, but we should not do it to the point of neglecting fixing what's going on now. You've used a statement which is, 90-some% of scientists, agree, that climate change is this terrible thing. So, a million scientists have a million different opinions, and that's been published that's a huge, huge inaccurate representation of what you mean by climate change. So most of them will say, yes, it is happening. So in terms of the severity and what's happening, you've even stated it's happening to farmers today. I would conjecture that that is hypothesis. Some people will say we're getting more severe weather events. I've talked to bona fide good meteorologists that say there is no evidence. I've looked at the data myself that we are getting more severe weather events. So it is not yet happening that we can say. It's like the flow data. So if I look at the Dunk River, it's decreasing. If I look at the Mill River, it's increasing. It's the same with that. So there is a lot of disagreement amongst the scientific community on the severity and nature of this thing. So you can't characterize it. Every scientist is, rapidly saying that the sky is going to fall and the world is going to end due to climate change. It will even have some good repercussions. So particularly if you live in a cold climate, it will have some very bad repercussions if you're living on a Pacific island. So not everything is necessarily good or bad about change. So some of it will be bad, some of it will actually be good. So there are more nutrients in the air and carbon dioxide to grow more crops in a cold climate like Canada. That's going to be the reality of it. So sorry, I probably ignored your other question that you had there after that.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Your characterization of how climate scientists are feeling is contrary to everything I have ever read. It's a supermajority of climate scientists who are coming forward indicating that we are experiencing climate change now, and it is the greatest threat to humanity that we have ever faced. I'm surprised you are presenting that as if there's some question on it. But the question I asked you was on the terms of reference for this proposed study. What is the question we are trying to answer specifically?
The question we're trying to answer specifically is what is the critical amount of flow we have to keep in PI streams to protect PI environment. So, but also, the secondary question to that, of course, which is very important, is could the use of irrigation actually have huge environmental benefits in terms of nutrient reduction? So it's not specifically related to flow, but it's an equally important question.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I agree with that. And when I heard you answering questions that my colleague was asking about if there are detrimental impacts to fish and to aquaculture, what will we do? And your answer that we could just dump more fish into the stream and that would take care of it seems like the question we're asking isn't whether or not we're going to have detrimental impacts to the environment, because it sounds like the solutions to them are being oversimplified, excuse me.
Well, first of all, that was specifically talking about mitigating the effects of the research itself, not of the activity of agricultural pumping. So again, the objective is that we don't see effects. This is the whole objective of the research, and this is what all of the partners and stakeholders want. Nobody wants their industry to affect the environment. So the point is that we don't see effects. However, the reality is that we can't exist as human beings without having some measurable effects. So if there are going to be effects, and the idea of compensation has been enshrined in the Fishery Act for some time. So if you are going to have an effect, if you're going to build an oil sands mine and dig up a stream, you must compensate by creating at least as much habitat and at least as much fisheries as you have destroyed. And compensation is, because we're not going to pay for water, that's people will not like that very much, but we can certainly compensate for our activities by improving the environment in other ways, and in essence might actually leave the environment in better shape, particularly in PEI, where there are areas where we've got a lot of compensating to do. So,
Thank you, Chair. You had indicated that new test wells would be essential in order to gather baseline data, and what I was talking about earlier is the importance of baseline data and how little of that we actually have. You are saying we must have that, and it is my understanding that in order to collect accurate baseline data, you cannot take it from just 1 year or even a couple of years, because as you indicated, stream levels can fluctuate greatly within a few years. How many years do you think it would take to establish baseline data, which you indicated is absolutely essential, before you could start testing these wells?
Well, as scientists, we would always like more. We were able to do it at Coles Creek with 2 years. So one of these proposed sites, I'm already collecting baseline data for that reason, even though I'm not funded, just going out on a limb to do it because I do think it's so important. So we're finding ways to do it already. So I think in the agricultural scenario, you may not need as much baseline data because the stream can be its own baseline within a given year. So in that, if you start, your recharge is going down through the year, if you start pumping on June 15th or July 15th, you can see immediate effects in real time on both the groundwater and potentially on the stream if you're pumping enough. So the part of the research is to get to the point too where we're more confident that we can look at change without that much baseline data, because we're not going to have 10 years of baseline data for 200 and some watersheds and PEI. That's just never, ever going to happen. So we have to find out how to make decisions in the best way with what baseline data we do have. So, but yes, it is important. I'm not saying we don't have to have it, but the more we collect, the more confident we are in making, predictions with less. So,
Lynn?
I'm good.
You're
Thank
good
you,
now?
Chair.
All right, I have Rob, Steve, and Michelle on my list. If we can try and, limit it to a few questions, just because we have the Federation of Agriculture waiting to present. So, Rob?
Yeah, Chair, just two kind of quick ones, and they're kind of follow-up to the Minister of Finance's question. So she'd mentioned about the possibility of farmers own the well, would government be it? Has there been any thought about the watersheds themselves actually owning the test wells and possibly use it as a potential revenue stream?
that has not been proposed at this point, Ned, I would say, that I recall. So the short answer would be no.
Rob?
And to follow up on that, and it just goes to a little bit, I have a daughter who lives in Germany, and I was asking, there's a lot of irrigation goes on in the Bavarian area in Germany, and one of the comments that I was told there is that everybody pays for water. Farmers pay a rate, different rate than residents would pay. Everybody pays. What's your thoughts about it? And you made a kind of a vague comment towards nobody likes to pay for water, but it is a resource. It's owned by the public. We're making decisions here based on the public. Is there any thoughts to the possibility of these particular wells having a fee based on the amount? We're putting meters on them. We know the amount, and it goes to something to enhance, like water authorities, I think, of the same concept where they, like in irrigation for canals and things of that nature, they have a small fee that goes on it. What's your thoughts on that?
I think it's a controversial subject. I'm not 100% for or against it. So certainly it's complicated by the fact that as humans we sort of consider water a right that we have, particularly for our daily uses. And it's even been suggested that, yeah, the fact that we're paying a water bill is just to get it to us. We're not actually paying for the water, so because this is a controversial topic. So yes, you could potentially, but there'd be a lot of argument that you're making me pay for something that's right under my land to begin with, right? So, and good arguments. So, I think since it is a controversial topic, that's probably not the direction we should go in. So, but we should go and say, okay, you're going to be taking water. The fact that you're taking water, you are having an environmental effect. We don't know if it's significant or dramatic at this point, let's say, but so as an industry, you're having an effect. If you want water, you want to take water, that's an environmental effect. What are you going to do to return to the environment to compensate for that effect so that we can actually be better off rather than worse off? So, and philosophically, I think that's a more palatable way to go for everybody, so and could result in significant environmental improvements.
Rob?
I guess my only point on that is instead of all of society paying for that environmental issues that might be impacted by that, this would be a way to those that use higher amounts of it, put small fees that goes back into dealing with that. So it just maybe it's a bit more user pay than everybody has to pay the consequences for that. That's it, Chair. Thanks.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Well, I had just one quick question for you, but I want to cover something that you said to my colleague here as well, so I got two for you now. So you mentioned climate change, and it's a variable, and it's hard to know exactly what model is going to be accurate and what's going to go where. Well, one thing we do know about climate change is that water patterns is at the heart of it, and the changing water patterns. And here we are talking about how much water recharge we have, how much rainfall we have here on PEI. So I don't know if it's a question or a comment, because we already kind of covered the precautionary principle, but in such a world where we may indeed have more years that are like this or even worse, I would really urge us to consider using data that is on the lower end of that scale rather than the median scale, looking at history and whatnot. And you had also mentioned that climate change doesn't increase storm intensities, and I question that just because we had a presentation in another special committee on climate change from a local climatologist who stated directly that yes, indeed, Dorian would have been worse with warmer temperatures, and Dorian would have been less intense with cooler temperatures of the ocean. So I guess I'm just wondering why there's such resistance to acknowledgement that climate change is going to be a huge factor in these kinds of regulations moving forward into the future. Could you comment on that?
Yeah, I don't mean to sound like a heretic, but all scientific data should be challenged, and I find it rather unusual that when you challenge somebody's data that you're treated like a heretic with regard to climate change. It is no longer scientific. So yes, it is happening. Yes, if it was warmer on that day, there would have been a worse storm, and yes, if it was cooler in that day, there might not have been as worse a storm. So, but you're then extrapolating that temperature on that day was directly attributable to climate change, right? So was it not? Was it actually cooler on that day to climate change, or was it actually warmer on that day to climate change? No climatologist in the world can tell you that with even a minute amount of certainty. So climate data, like flow data, you need at least 20 years of data. So 20 years of data is just a start. There's 100 years of NOAA data on weather events that does not suggest that yet that we're getting more severe weather events. It's similar with flow, it's very variable, so the data is not there to show it. So it's a good hypothesis, it's a reasonable hypothesis, it probably will happen. Water is critical. In fact, most people don't know that water is 70% of your equation in the climate models as the greenhouse gas that is responsible for 70% of the temperature increase. It's absolutely critical. So that hypothesis that you're going to have more water vapor in the atmosphere, so obviously things are going to be different. So I'm just saying, let's put things in perspective, people. So it almost seems like we're following the cult of climate change these days when we have a lot of issues, and climate change is one of them. It's a very severe issue. I'm not diminishing the severity, but climate change isn't causing our anoxic estuaries every summer. Every summer, tens of thousands of fish die. What do we say about this? There's an article in the newspaper every so often. So, hey, people, we can fix that problem. So let's fix some of the problems we have in the present day, as opposed to having this myopic focus on, a serious issue of climate change.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So my comment had to do with ocean temperatures, which don't fluctuate day to day, and it is a direct relation, so we can move on from this, though. My quick and easy question for you is, what is the cost per well in your study?
To actually put the wells in, so we're probably talking roughly about $15,000 just for the high capacity well. That's presuming that it actually yields water. So, because of course not every hole you put in the ground yields enough water even to be considered high capacity. So it's a bit hit and miss. So plus that doesn't include the monitoring wells, which would be less, but because they're smaller, more wells. But so roughly $15,000 in drilling costs, I would estimate. So that's a rough guesstimate. So.
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you very much for the presentation. So I just wanted to touch on the monitoring wells. Something that I hear quite frequently from people who are concerned about high capacity wells is the impacts to the residents' wells. And will their well go dry? Will there be salt intrusion? That kind of thing. So your monitoring wells, are they set up similar to replicate that scenario? So if it was like a neighboring well of a resident?
The quick answer is no, not necessarily. They're set up specifically to measure the depression in the groundwater cone as we're pumping, but, and this has been, it's a good question, it's been brought up many times, it is relatively easy for us to also monitor any household wells that are within a reasonable proximity of any high-capacity wells, both for salinity incursion if we figure it's an area where that's a danger, as well as for the water level. So we would certainly propose doing that, basically just instrument these people's wells to see if we can detect a difference. And why not too? They're wells that are already drilled in the ground that we don't have to pay for, so it's a great idea all around to do that. So,
Michelle?
Thank you, Chair. And have you reached out in your test sites, have you reached out to residents to ask them if they would be partners within the study?
not yet, no. So we don't yet have a project until we can get wells approved. So there essentially is no project, so until we could get exploratory permits. So we haven't gone to that next step yet, so.
Michelle?
And so just to cover off the negative impacts, so through your testing, if there's negative impacts, and we have residents whose wells potentially, which is a valid concern, goes dry, the next step for them would be to drill a deeper well, essentially, from my understanding. Do you have any comment on that as to the, I guess, the concern about that for islanders?
Well, that's not entirely accurate, not necessarily deeper well, but a well in a slightly different location, because actually you get less yield of water the deeper you go. So even in a high capacity well, much of the water is coming from the shallower layers below your casing. So the deeper you go, the less yield of water you get. So no, you wouldn't drill a deeper well, you'd just find another spot, punch a hole to hopefully hit a better spot to get water. So.
Michelle?
Sorry, and I'm going to go back to the funding component. So you had said that you require private, public, or not-for-profit organizations for the funding in order to leverage that for the grant, correct?
Right.
So can you tell me where the funding is going to come from in order for you to accumulate those dollars to apply for the grant?
It's been proposed that we use the provincial money for Coles Creek and/or a proposed extension from that as, for the time being, as some of the leverage. Some money would have to come from the industry through the partner, the Federation of Agriculture. So as to how that is going to happen, I can't tell you yet, or where it's going to come from.
Michelle?
Good, thank you,
You
Chair.
good? All right, is anyone with the last? Ole?
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I had a couple of questions. I think it actually sounds like a great idea to get some real data. So essentially what you're doing is in going to watersheds that don't have any high capacity wells and putting one in to see what the effect is. So in order to see how it works, I assume that you're working with the farmer to have a watering system to. Isn't the cost of the watering system itself considerably more than the cost of the wells?
Yeah, it will be quite extensive, and again, that hasn't all worked out. So those farmers that are contractors, there have been arrangements made with Cavendish Farms that there would be an agreement where some of the upfront costs were borne by that contract, the Cavendish Farms. So, and the farmer would eventually pay for it, if as far as my knowledge of that agreement goes, which I'm not entirely privy to all the details. So as to the others, we don't know yet. Some of them do have existing infrastructure already. Again, we haven't been really got down to the nuts and bolts of all that till we actually have a viable project. So this is basically doing this on our volunteer time now for 3 years, trying to get a project to the point where we can work out those details. So,
Ole?
There was another question that I had time to get a handle on. That's the relationship between the capacity of a well and the area that's needed to provide that capacity. Do you have a simple number for that, or does it vary tremendously across PEI? Because
I'm sure hydrogeologists might have some number for that. I do not have one at the top of my head. It might vary much more regionally than we think as well. So again, much hydrogeology has been done in certain regions, and there are certainly differences with regard to the nature of the aquifers, I believe, in different regions. So that number could vary as well. But yeah, there is no set number there, though obviously we have pretty good idea from the 300 high-capacity wells that are out there, some of them monitored with groundwater monitoring wells like Coles Creek, what that area is, so roughly, so, and what the capacity would be. I just don't have those numbers on my head, on the tip of my tongue, so.
Ole?
So like in the Coles Creek area, that's where the well field is for Charlottetown? Does do the wells pretty much take the entire capacity of that watershed?
Well, they've taken 30% of the stream flow at a particular point, so roughly, as far as we can figure out what they're pumping at now. So that's not the capacity of the whole watershed, no. So, and that's at the lowest flow month, of course, so that percentage would be much, much lower in January or February. So.
Ole?
Just one last question. There's a big difference between extracting for city, where you basically dump the water you extract out in the river, and irrigation, where you put it in the ground. Does some of that recharge the ground again?
I've certainly brought that up to the variety of experts from time to time, and there is some feeling that with irrigated water, because it is your warmer months, that not much of it would either end up in the plant or as evaporation or transpiration, so that not much of it certainly would end up back in the recharge again. And actually probably the objective is to use as little water as possible so that it does all get to the plant, so that we're not pumping any more than we have to as well. So
You good? Thank you. All right, well, Doctor, thank you very much for your presentation and taking our questions, and we're just going to recess for a few minutes for our next presenters. Okay, welcome back, everyone. So with us now, we have the president of the PEI Federation of Agriculture, Ron Maynard, and the executive director, Robert Godfrey. And I guess what we'll do, we'll just do the same thing we did for the last presentation. We'll let you go ahead with your presentation, and we'll do questions at the end if that's all right. I'm assuming you have a presentation. All right, so with that, we'll hand it over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Introduce myself. As the Chairman said, I'm Ron Maynard. I'm the President of the Federation of Agriculture. I farm in the Tyne Valley area on land that my family has farmed since 1822, on land that was cleared by the Acadians 100 years before that. So we were in for the long haul. I farm in partnership with my cousin. We were fortunate to have the next generation on the farm farming with us. It's they're doing the work. Reason why I can be here today. I want to thank the committee for the invitation to share the presentation. The impact of the Water Act and the regulations this committee has review will impact a great deal of change in climate, the context of water. This presentation will focus on our submission to the government regarding the draft regulations and lay out the suggested path forward, particularly on the need for research to begin immediately around the issue of supplemental irrigation for agriculture. Just a little of who we are. We are the PEI Federation of Agriculture. We are the largest general farm organization in the province. We make up 550 farming operations as well as 16 different commodities. The memberships include large organizations like the Dairy Farmers of PEI and the PEI Potato Board, medium-sized organizations like the Certified Organic Growers Co-op and the PEI Young Farmers, and small organizations like the Strawberry Growers Association and the Sheep Breeders Association. As a united voice of industry, we speak for over 85% of the PEI producers. Agriculture is by far the #1 economic driver of the PEI economy. After factoring in a multiple factor and spin-offs for the industry we are talking about a $3 billion industry in a $7 billion economy. In 2019, island farmers employed approximately 4,900 islanders and spent over $70 million in wages. The success of our farmer community has directly impact on our provincial economy and our provincial coffers. With COVID-19, we will drive the economic recovery. The farmer community has often been criticized that we are not being responsible stewards of our land, that we are not doing our part for the environment. The fact is, farmers in this province have continuously been trying to raise the bar when it comes to farming more sustainably. I want to highlight a few of the things in the background for this committee to know. In the late 2018, the PEI Federation of Agriculture and PEI Watershed Alliance were both meeting with government talking about issues on the waterways and utilizing government resources. So the PEI Federation of Agriculture and the PEI Watershed Alliance met and discovered that they share many goals. In March of 2019, the PEI Federation of Agriculture partnered with the PEI Water Alliance to tackle runoff and erosion issues facing island waterways. We formed an alliance. Our goals are mitigation, eliminating fish kills and runoff events, keeping soils in the fields, developing industry standards that will increase sustainability measures and serve as a basis for due diligence. Industry standards are near complete. This is a project that we've been working on for the last year. Supported by the PEIFA, supported by the Potato Board, and it's before the board of the PEI Watershed Alliance now. It will improve how we farm around waterways and further our goals around sustainable farming here on PEI. We recognize that there's no simple silver bullet to solve some of the challenges the agriculture industry face on PEI. We need a holistic approach, like a toolbox, using multiple tools to grow food in the most sustainable and socially responsible way possible. In that spirit, this slide points out some of that. Agriculture and Ag Food Canada created a Living Labs research project here on Prince Edward Island, investing $2.4 million centered on soil health. We know that by improving organic matter and making our farms not only more sustainable, we also make them more profitable. We need a healthy environment in order to remain profitable. Federation completed a report in 2019 that looked at the best management practice for reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Many of these practices improve soil health. Dr. Dave Burton, a member of Dr. Michael's Van den Heuvel's research team, was one of the authors of this project. We talked about cover crops, reducing tillage, increased rotations, alternate rotational crops, and tile drainage. The Federation also administers the Environmental Farm Plan in this province. These plans are a practical plan of operating a farm in a way that is environmentally sustainable, socially acceptable, and economically viable. There are over 500 of them in operation in Prince Edward Island. The vast majority of farms has an environmental farm plan. They are renewed every 5 years. The Flora Nutrient Stewardship, is an initiative between industry and government that looks at the efficient use of fertilizers, the 4 R's: the right source, the right time, the right place, at the right rate. PIFA actually chairs the initiative that all 3 major retailers of fertilizers also joined in recent years to promote the initiative to their growers. The Water Act is a foundational piece of legislation. Its importance is undeniable and therefore of great interest to all islanders. We all drink water. We all use water. We all want to protect it. And I want to make it very clear, PIFA supports the Water Act. We believe in the need for water for future generations. We think monitoring is important, and use of this precious resource must have adequate levels of control. We also want to be clear that we have a long history of working with government, and this legislation will be no exception. We want to work with all parties to make sure revisions which we feel are needed within the draft regulations. PI Federation of Agriculture has examined these regulations with great detail. To be quite frank, this committee, we have found them to be discriminatory towards food production. Agriculture is singled out as the lone industry where the regulatory denial access to water for specific purposes. This is unacceptable. We are frustrated that this continues to be the case despite repeated discussions about the issue. Everyone in this room knows that agriculture is a cornerstone of who we are on the island, the foundation of our economy, the backbone of rural PEI, and the center of our food supply. PEI is well positioned to continue to grow as long as we have a robust agricultural industry underpinning the economy. We truly are facing crisis. Without water, food simply does not grow. Without water, family farms who have farmed for generations, like my own, could be lost. We will lose farms because of this drought. Without water, we do not have a reliable access to safe, healthy, local food here in the province. This is a trend that can be stopped in its tracks if we have the courage to take the necessary action. This slide, it's a very busy slide, was prepared by Don Jardine at the UPI Climatology Lab. It illustrates just how hard it has been to grow food in Prince Edward Island the last 6 growing seasons. We see the curves. It's not very clear there maybe, but see it very clear that in July, no rain in July, little rain in August. And in the 2020 growing season, it's extended even further. The numbers are facts based on numbers that do not lie. This slide is irrefutable. And as Dr. Michael Van den Heuvel just said, it's we're getting less rain in July. It matches that the UPI climatology Adam French has found in his climate models. PEI will experience more participation overall, This will fall in winter, spring, and fall, and we can expect drier summers for the foreseeable future. These are facts that are unfortunately cannot be denied. This is climate change, and it's here now. Action is needed. During the growing season, some wish to irrigate when needed. The benefits are clear. Increased marketable yield per acre, improvement of product quality. Less stress equals less disease. This reduces the use of pesticides. Increased efficiency of fertilizers. Reduce nitrate leaching. In August, granular fertilizer still sits in the fields. No rain to uptake it. When the rain comes in the fall and the winter, the fertilizer has nowhere to go but down. And we wonder why we have a nitrate issue. The bottom line, further irrigation promotes plant growth, a great contributor towards soil health and organic matter. Bottom line, irrigation actually improves the way we manage our soils and can allow us to have a positive effect on the environment. This next data you've seen before. It is part of the government's own research that was presented to this committee in January of this year and has been part of the government's presentation since the inception of the Water Act began. 2.4 billion cubic meters of water is replenished annually through precipitation. PEI uses about 1.5% of this replenished rate. And of that 1.5%, only 2% of the 1.5% used groundwater is used for irrigation, a portion of which is used for golf courses. George Summers and Bruce Raymond presented the figures to you on January 30th of 2020. They told this committee that PEI has abundance of water, and there was great discussion over the figures on this slide that pointed to the very low amounts of water currently being used in the province of Prince Edward Island as a whole for a variety of reasons. These figures were determined through scientific methodology that you would think would be irrefutable. We have contended for years that these numbers provide a solid case against the current moratorium. We continue to argue that the case is clear, that the water resource is there for supplemental irrigation. These pictures that you see here are photos were taken on August 20th in a field on Argyll Shore. You'll see the difference between irrigated and dry land. This is a strip of a 10-foot strip of potatoes that were dug in the same field, say one with irrigation, one without. We see the moisture levels, and we see the hundredweights that are there. The farmer estimated that the difference would be from $2,000 to $3,000 per acre, the difference between the irrigated yield and the non-irrigated yield. Clearly illustrates the case that why PEI agriculture is asking for irrigation. We simply cannot grow food in Prince Edward Island by hoping and praying for rain. Mr. Raymond presented many of these facts to us at the PEI Federation's annual general meeting in January of 2014. The following resolution was unanimously passed by the members of that day and has been reaffirmed by the PEI Federation Board of Directors. And I want to read this to you. Whereas the Department of Environment has reviewed all available science data and determined that there is adequate water available for long-term sustainability, be it resolved that the PEI Federation of Agriculture requests the Department of Environment remove the moratorium on new wells for supplemental agricultural irrigation, provided that the scientific data shows that it will not negatively impact the environment, and that the PEI water extraction policy, what we know as the Water Act now, provides the adequate controls for the setting and operation of any new wells. And the Federation of Agriculture still stands by this resolution today. While we believe that the science is there, we certainly understand the concerns of islanders. It has been expressed by many throughout the consultations of the Water Act legislation and again on the Water Act regulations, that the science is not adequate and is not detailed enough to support the lifting of the moratorium. If that is the government's position, then PEIFA recommends we study supplemental irrigation directly. You heard earlier this morning from Dr. Van Heuvel. His team is impeccable. His research will be the same. Allow him to provide proof or disproof the current science. Give him the green light as soon as possible. And I think you've had a broad knowledge of the program this morning. You know, as Dr. Van Heuvel said himself, he has been critical of agricultural industry in the past. We know he will follow the science whatever it leads him, and will provide this committee and government with the unbiased facts, clear and simple. We also believe this study will provide an opportunity to measure the agronomics, economics, and environmental impact of supplemental irrigation will have on individual field and individual operations. I also want to point out, as Dr. Van Heuvel said, that the present regulations will not allow for research, and this must be changed. But we want to recognize that these sections of the draft regulations are discriminatory towards the industry that should be reviewed with a critical eye because producers need water today. There are many concerns about what we tell their financial institutions in the spring on why that financial institution should finance them to plant another crop. All three parties represented in this committee speak loudly about their belief in science-based decision-making. All three are reasonable and sensible when it comes to science when it's presented to them. PEIFA shares this view. We understand water as a public resource can evoke emotions and fear that drive our decisions. It is why the issue of high-capacity wells and supplemental irrigation is so contentious. Science should lead to help agriculture and protect our water. Access and allocation of resources are precious, as water should be using science-based methodology to develop an independent expert like Dr. Van Heuvel and his team. We are prepared to help to ensure that that takes place. Approve the project as a pilot project. On to the next slide, just a map of high-capacity wells, locations across Prince Edward Island. There's over 300 of them spread across Prince Edward Island. This plus domestic supply still only amounts to 1.5% of the replenished or recharged water we get every year. When we speak about transparency from the pilot project, we point to Section 7 as a unique requirement to ensure that any water withdrawal permit holders provide the minister with data from any flow measuring device or water leveling measuring device. The PEIFA believes this regulation intended is to ensure the permit holder is adherent to the law and water extraction is sustainable. However, this regulation must be expanded. What if the data for high-capacity wells were to be put into a database that was public? Provide islanders with a clear picture of how much water is being drawn down and by whom. Include municipal wells, golf courses, aquaculture, hotels, car washes, and others who use great volumes of water throughout the year. We would also include the 35 existing high-capacity wells currently in place for supplemental agricultural irrigation. Let islanders get a true understanding of who is using water and how much it's drawn down. To compare agricultural usage over a course of 2 months to the rest of the high-capacity permit holders certainly would put the issue in context for many islanders. Talked about holding ponds. We think holding ponds are an integral part of a larger irrigation strategy. Passing another moratorium targeting agriculture further exacerbates the discrimination towards the access for the industry. We ask that the government departments of an agricultural environment work with industry to develop a responsible approach to the construction and operation of holding ponds. They can act as catchment basements to prevent runoff and collect water through the rain and snow melt, as well as the source of irrigation. They have a purpose. Grandfather Section 5, Paragraph 7. Ponds were constructed legally through a large capital investment by a farmer. So it should be left available to be operated, once again, under the restrictions that we see put in place by the Department of Environment and Agriculture. The using holding ponds initiate, we need a broader strategy on irrigation, and holding ponds should be some of those. The moratorium was always meant to be temporary. However, it has remained in place for 18 years. While other industries, including golf courses, car washes, and others, have access to high-capacity wells, agriculture doesn't. We're asking to level the playing field, eliminate the discrimination. Enshrining the moratorium in the regulations legislates discrimination. Science-based decisions is paramount. Dr. Van den Heuvel and his team is ready to move forward, approve the project as a pilot. Irrigation is not a silver bullet, but is one of the important tools within a larger toolbox that farmers need to grow safe and accessible local food. PEI Federation of Agriculture is willing and eager to develop a strong partnership with research, government, and industry to protect our water resources and preserve our industry. Thank you for your time and your attention, and we will gladly take any questions that we have in our presentation.
Thank you. Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Ron and Robert, for coming in today. I really appreciate you taking the time to sit down and talk with us. I think it's incredibly important that we have a discussion broadly on the sustainability of agriculture into the future. You were talking about agriculture as the cornerstone of rural communities and a big piece of our economy, and I completely agree with you. That is something that I worry about tremendously into the future, and I'd love to unpack that a little bit with you. Could you give me, first of all, a sense of the cost associated with a high-capacity well and an irrigation system? If a farmer was going to install this, can you give me a sense of what sort of capital investment they would be looking for off the top?
So as you heard from Dr. Michael Van den Heuvel, digging a well is somewhere between $15,000 to $20,000. We know that. And then the actual irrigation system, you can get some pretty advanced technology on them. They're about somewhere around $200,000 to $300,000, depending on what you buy.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. $200,000 to $300,000 is a sizable expense. Thank you for the context on that. I also appreciate the fact that at the beginning of your presentation, and I meant to say this sooner, you acknowledged the realities of climate change and the challenge of that as a farmer here today. I was very surprised to hear our previous presenter talk about climate change as if it's not a problem for farmers in our current day and age, and that this is some issue 100 years from now. That's plainly not the case, and I haven't spoken to a single farmer this summer who is not feeling the implications of climate change, so I'm glad that that came up. And it's an issue that is going to uniquely impact farmers. You're so reliant on weather and weather patterns for your crops. Can you give me a sense of what is the optimal daytime average temperature for most commercial potatoes that we're growing in PEI?
Well, I'm sorry, re-ask the question?
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Every crop has an ideal temperature range. Temperatures above this range and the outcome falls. Below this range, we just don't get the yield. I'm wondering if you can give me a sense of what the optimal daytime temperature range is for the varieties of potatoes we're growing on PEI.
Well, I first want to say that I think it's important to recognize that we're here to talk about irrigation for all crops. So I would preface with that. And I mean, I'm not an expert in the growing of potatoes, so I'm not sure I can answer your question in the way that maybe you're looking for.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I did some research on this before we came in, and actually CBC did a really excellent article on this in 2018, pointing to some research that has indicated even minor temperature increases in the day will substantially decrease potato yields. But CBC pointed out a study in 2018, but it was certainly not the first, or was it unique? There's a lot of information on this. I was doing some research before we came in that indicated that for most commercial potato breeds, a daytime temperature of between 14 and 22 degrees Celsius is the ideal range, and even a couple of degrees above that, you see yields plummet. CBC's article said that there were actually a great number of varieties that above those ranges didn't produce any tubers whatsoever, even though the plants themselves were getting larger and larger from the CO2, like the last presenter talked about. The tubers themselves simply don't form. And there's no part of that study that indicates irrigation is going to be a fix for that. My first sitting in this legislature, I asked the minister responsible for agriculture if he was going to take the advice of Dr. Fennick, who you referenced earlier, and start doing a comprehensive study on the crop opportunities and challenges for PEI based on the growing conditions that are anticipated in the next decade, because lead times on changes in agriculture are long. And I think farmers are particularly vulnerable to having to deal with these impacts of climate change. So I would be personally incredibly reluctant to see farmers invest $300,000 into infrastructure only to discover that the daytime average temperatures are going to have profound, devastating impacts on their crops. It seems incredibly short-sighted. So I was saying to the previous presenter, I think the question we ask at the beginning is so relevant to the answers we're going to get at the end. And if we just increase water, does that mitigate all of the other problems for farmers? Absolutely not. What it does instead is gives them a false sense of security that this is going to be the fix. I think the first thing we need to find out is what is the reality of our growing conditions for PEI, what is going to be viable here, so we don't inadvertently put farmers in a more vulnerable position. I'm just wondering what your comments are on that.
So there's
Here would be, you're talking about $200,000 to $300,000. Remember my picture. $2,000 to $3,000 was the difference between the irrigated and the non-irrigated crop. So if I've got 100 acres of land, 100 acres of potatoes, you know, I paid for that in 1 year. It's the reality. The reality as far as temperature goes is the temperature in Prince Edward Island is probably less than in many, many other areas that grows potatoes, and many other areas that grow other crops. Irrigation is available in every other jurisdiction around the world except Prince Edward Island.
And I would add that if you're taking a longer-term view on agriculture, as you have in your comments, then you need to take a longer view on the diversity of agriculture and the opportunities that climate change will actually present. And if you're going to do that, if you're being realistic about PEI, you know, we're not going to bring in larger commodities that are just going to simply replace potato acreage or grain acreage or whatever it might be. You're going to see things that we're already seeing. You're going to see high bush blueberries. You're going to see peaches and apples and pears that you're seeing in western parts of PEI. And the fact is, if you're going to attract new investment, new crops to agriculture, you're going to need to give access to water. I think the minister that you cited, Minister Thompson, points out the example of a hops grower who looked at PEI considerably this year, and without the access to water, set up shop in Nova Scotia. So if we're going to be realistic about climate change as we are, and a longer-term view on agriculture, on PEI, without access to water, it will be very hard to attract those niche crops that we'll need to attract as we change.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I agree with you that we're going to have to look at that from a broad perspective, and I entirely agree with that. I've had conversations with so many farmers in the last few months about this particular growing season because, oh my goodness, it's been just unlike anything else that most farmers have ever experienced. But so many of the farmers that I'm talking to that are not growing potatoes, when I ask them, tell me, if we lifted the moratorium on high-capacity wells tomorrow, could your operation afford the installation costs? And I'm hearing again and again from people, aside from people who are growing potatoes, of course, that I do understand that the water in the short term would probably pay off your capital investment. I do, but that's not the case for most other crops. I'm hearing from people again and again that they're not in the position to put up that capital investment for access to water. So I do note that in that 2018 article that CBC put out on the problems for the potato industry, particularly around heat and daytime temperatures, Greg Donald was interviewed, and he had said that this is a problem that they're well aware of, and what we really need is to develop varieties that are suited to the climate. What he says, and I quote, is, we need short season big yielder that work well with rain-fed systems and increasingly erratic weather patterns. That's a quote from Greg Donald from the PEI Potato Board, I believe. What he was advocating for when asked about the problems of heat, particularly as it pertains to potato crops, wasn't access to water, but was instead access to different varieties. I wonder how you comment on that.
Well, I think our slide actually shows that irrigation has an impact, regardless of temperature. I mean, I can go back, maybe that'll help to... No, but I think the picture speaks volumes. So I think it's important that we bring it back up. So in this particular case, this guy grew those potatoes in Argyle Shore in the summer of 2020. So this summer, he saw, it's very clear the differences in hundredweight. He told us in that field that he was looking at a loss of somewhere over $1 million based on the fact that he just simply didn't have access to water on parts of his operation. Parts of his operation are going to yield 439 hundredweight per acre versus 214. And the moisture levels, I should point out as well, 4.6 and 5.3, you need about 10% moisture level to grow anything. I mean, you think of the amount of times you cut your lawn this summer, probably not very many, especially in the months of July and August. So I think it's irrefutable to say that water is not necessary to grow any crop.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. Oh, I don't disagree that water is a necessary component of farming. There's no question about that. I think the question is whether or not we should have a test project on high-capacity wells for irrigation. And when you look at the list of 36, I believe, high-capacity wells that are currently used for agriculture, the vast majority of them are for potatoes. And it is my summation that based on the fact that we need to make decisions based on science, and the science is telling us again and again that the growing conditions on PEI are going to be particularly poorly suited for potatoes, I wonder if we're asking the wrong question. The average daytime temperatures are going to be and are predicted to be well above the range where studies are demonstrating these crops fail. I'm very concerned about the sustainability of agriculture if we don't take the long view and do a comprehensive study of crops that will perform really well, and there will be new opportunities. I completely agree with that. There are a number of pulses that require less irrigation, that can do well in drier, hotter climates. There are lots of opportunities, and I wouldn't want to guess what the outcome of that study would be, but I think that's a critically important piece of research for us to be doing for PEI.
You said, Ms. Lund, they work with irrigation. That would not be an option on Prince Edward Island, the way we have a moratorium in irrigation now.
I'm so sorry, I
Lynn?
can't hear you. Sorry, Sharon.
I said, you just said that there was pulses that do very well with irrigation.
Without irrigation, is what I said.
I thought you said with irrigation. Okay.
No.
Okay.
think it's also important to remember that the study that we're proposing is looking at adding a fourth well that will be either cold crops or carrots. And the commitment that we've gotten from the Horticultural Council is that we will include one of those crops in our study, the study that eventually, hopefully this committee recommends it goes forward. I think that, you keep talking about the longer term, and I keep talking about if you're taking a longer term, you need access to water. There's a high bush blueberry operation about 25 minutes from where we're sitting that has irrigation out of a holding pond. And he has pipe running in between his high bush blueberries throughout the operations. It's quite impressive. And he would not get the yields that he achieves without water. And he wouldn't be here if he wasn't able to dig that holding pond and get access to water. I think that, if you talk about diversification of agriculture and you're real about that, then you've got to be real about access to water. And we're asking at the end of the day that we simply do a research project that's going to examine that very issue. So I don't know why I'm not saying that you do oppose it, but it does sound like you do. And I need to understand why.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So what I'm saying is that I think what we desperately need is a cohesive strategy that takes into account the reality of the situation that is facing farmers on PEI. And do I believe that irrigation in various forms is going to have to be part of our agricultural future on PEI? Of course, I know that access to water is critical. I am not in favor of golf courses having access to water from high-capacity wells. I don't think that's a logical choice, and I would have no objection to this committee putting forward recommendations saying new golf courses are not going to be accessing high-capacity wells. I think that makes loads of sense. I think what we have to talk about is what irrigation is going to look like. Now, based on my understanding of the recommendations, even as they're proposed, there is no ban on irrigation. You are allowed to access water. You just cannot access water from a well that draws more than 345 cubic meters a day. But I have to assume even 345 cubic meters a day would have some beneficial impact on agriculture. Even the types of moratoriums on holding ponds that are being proposed are not on moratoriums carte blanche. I think we all think there's benefits to holding ponds, but the types of holding ponds that have been constructed as a mechanism by which to bypass the moratorium on high-capacity wells are more the ones that are drawing the attention of people. There are holding pond patterns that are drawn out in Europe, for example, that are not fed by wells but are designed to capture runoff and snowmelt, things that prevent nutrients from reaching waterways. I think all of that is very positive. I think drip irrigation systems are really positive. I think a lot of the types of things that you're talking about are not things that I oppose. It's an oversimplification to pretend that they are. I think that there are numerous ways we can be talking about irrigation, and I absolutely think that has to be part of the conversation. I'm just not yet convinced that it has to be from high-capacity wells.
All the more reason to do the research. All the more reason to allow Michael Van Heuvel to go forward with his research project that will examine irrigation on these crops. And he will say, if what you're contending is accurate, he will prove that, or he'll disprove that. You know what I'm saying? I don't, if irrigation does not have a positive effect on potatoes due to temperature or the various things that you've pointed out, then his research will show that. I mean, the individual, Dr. Michael Van Heuvel, is a highly respected scientist. He's been critical of us as recently as a few years ago. He was not viewed as a friend of the farming community for some time, but I can tell you that we've gone to him because we know that he will follow the facts, he will present a case, either for or against. He will simply lay out for this government, for this committee, for this province, whether or not irrigation has positive benefits and whether it's possible here on PEI.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So you say Dr. Vander Heuvel, is that correct?
Michael Vandenheuvel.
Vanden Heuvel, thank you, is a respected scientist who will prove this, and he also told the committee that he's not convinced on the realities of climate change. So I think that's, well,
I would disagree with that.
okay, I would also disagree with that, and I think it's an important point. But you're saying he will prove conclusively whether or not irrigation has a positive impact on potatoes, but we asked him, on crops.
Yes.
We asked him what the terms of reference are. I asked him that specifically. What is the question you're trying to answer? He did not indicate that he's trying to answer the question of whether or not irrigation will improve volume. In fact, I asked him that specifically, and he said he's trying to demonstrate whether or not irrigation has a negative impact on water flow in streams. So I think the question we ask is so relevant to the answers we receive. His research isn't going to prove whether or not average daytime temperatures have an impact on tuber production, because that's not in the scope of what we're asking him to research at all. I think that's exactly why we need a comprehensive study on crop opportunities and challenges for PEI, so we can course way forward for island farmers.
So I'm clear, so you're against a research project on you're opposed to a research project on irrigation because you think we need another research project on diversity in agriculture?
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. So that's in no way what I said. I don't think we need a research project on diversity in agriculture. I'm sorry if I was unclear on that. What I think we need is the same study that the UPEI Climate Lab has been recommending since 2017, and yet not one government has acted on that. They are saying that one of the biggest threats to island farms is the realities of climate change, and one of our biggest knowledge gaps is what crops are going to do well and what crops are going to fail as a result of climate change. UPEI Climate Lab, Adam Fennick, who you referenced a couple of times earlier, has been calling for this. This is a huge knowledge gap, and I think that if we are going to have a sustainable future for agriculture on Prince Edward Island, it is critical that we have the science that you're saying we need. We absolutely need science to guide our decisions. And I think it would be remarkably short-term thinking to not look in context of the whole climate change scenario for agriculture when we're planning for the future.
But though the Federation is not opposed to any study that looks at diversification of agriculture on PEI.
I will address someone else's questions.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Just start off by saying, good presentation, guys, and I fully support farmers on Prince Edward Island. I want to see them do well and realize that it takes water to grow crops well. But there's some nuances here about accessing our water and how much is safe and things like that, and how much it might be needed for various crops and in various situations. So I heard you say that irrigation's not a silver bullet, and it's one of the tools in the toolbox, and I fully believe that. Would you be open to further conditions on permits, ones that take into other factors such as soil organic matter? And the reason I bring this up is related to this slide that you have up here. Do we know what the soil organic matter is in this field that these statistics were taken from? Because I know moisture content and the health of the soil are directly related.
I can comment on that briefly. I can tell you that the grower of those potatoes does. In fact, the grower of those potatoes has a study going on in the field next to those photos on organic matter in itself. He's part of a research trial. As we pointed out in a couple of our slides, there's a considerable amount of research going into soil health and soil organic matter. But I've talked to organic growers this summer who will tell you, and the Organic Association, I should point out, is also interested in looking at irrigation as a study. Not necessarily ours, but looking at irrigation is something to consider because even the best organic matter levels this summer didn't carry you through. Water retention is great when there's water, but the slide that we showed earlier, I mean, we started out low. 2020 is one of the driest summers on record. So at the end of the day, even the strongest fields with organic matter were facing challenges come August of this summer.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. And that is exactly what I'm hearing when I speak to the various farmers, that would have been nice to have some water this year, whether they're a potato farmer, whether they're a small organic farmer. Some more water in a year like this would be better. But Well, my question was do we know what the soil organic matter is in this particular field showing this distinction here? And what I wonder is, it sounds like he's doing some work in that kind of field beside him and getting that data, so perhaps we don't, is the answer that we don't know what the soil organic?
I don't personally know, so I can't share that number, but I,
Certainly, higher organic matter this year would have made a difference between a, 30% loss and a 25% decrease in yield. Water would have made a difference between 5 and 10. It's one of the tools in the toolbox. That's what we're asking about. That's what we're saying.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So in that situation you were just talking about there, Mr. Maynard, would the aggregation of that be 15% bonus if you had your soil health up and your irrigation available?
Well, once again, it depends on the year. I mean, I can't say that's this year, but certainly it's going to be, you're going to have higher retention of moisture with a higher organic matter.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So that sounds like you need less irrigation, the better your health of your soil is.
Yeah, sure. I mean, now don't forget, we talked about the cost. The capital cost of acquiring the equipment is there, but the cost of operating is there too. You've got to power these things. You've got to have manpower to move them, to put them in place. I don't know of any farmer that wants to irrigate. I mean, this farmer here, he talks about having the precise precision. He was talking about 1 inch. He used to use it back a few years ago. 1 inch of rain was the 1 inch of moisture per week on the crop. Now he's down to 0.75, and he's looking at 0.7 because it costs to pump water.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So would it be more or less expensive to increase soil health versus increase irrigation? Is there some sort of balance that you know of there? Is there?
Once again, it's a tool. You need both of them. You need the option to have both of them. Yes, improving soil health, improving soil organic matter will retain more moisture. We know that for sure.
Steve?
So there's no moisture there to retain, and that's what we're talking about.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So back to my original question. Would you be in favor of having some additional conditions on permits that are tied to things like soil organic matter?
It's one of the options, yes.
Steve?
Chair. And I just reiterate my colleagues' comments. I absolutely agree with no more high-capacity wells for golf courses either. If we're not going to use it to grow our food, then we shouldn't be using it to manicure our lawns.
What we're talking about here, Mr. Chairman, is we've talked about here the irrigation strategy. Let's look at a strategy of how we utilize the resources of water so let's make sure it's sustainable and economically available to producers.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. I heard you say that there's about 35 agri high-capacity wells right now. If we were to just go ahead and change things today, and what kind of demand are we talking about? How many high-capacity wells would you foresee being installed by farmers in order to satisfy the need that you see?
I don't have that figure off the top of my head.
it would all depend on, I mean, as we've recognized, it is a capital cost. I mean, $300,000 to put in context, you think of the average cost of a tractor or combine nowadays. I come down to the individual farm, and I know talking to even some potato growers who've told me they have no interest in irrigation, just given where they are or the success they've managed to have with or without water. So yeah, we can't really answer that definitively.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair.
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, sure.
I have a neighbor that has an irrigation, has a high capacity well. It's probably the last one that was drilled on Prince Edward Island. He's fortunate that he has a block of land, 300, 400, 500 acres, a block of land that he can do that with. My cousins that grow twice the amount of potatoes he does are stretched over 20 kilometers stretch. Irrigation is not an option for them. They've got to look at the other tools that are available.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So did I hear that it's only in the, if your land is all centralized there, that your irrigation is true?
Yeah, as Lynn says, it's the economics aspect of it also. If you're going to spend $300,000, you can't spend $300,000 on a 20-acre field here and another 40-acre field that's 2 kilometers down the road.
Steve?
So this non-high capacity wells, is there any sort of direct relation between the amount of water we're extracting and how many acres we can cover with that? Do you guys have any sort of data you can give us on that?
Steve, I don't understand the question.
Steve?
Well, let's say 100 cubic meters of irrigation water. How much would that at a time, or daily, sorry?
I don't irrigate, and so I don't, those figures I don't have. Sorry, Steve.
I don't understand the question either. Say that again.
Steve?
The question is, farmers have access to irrigation right now, just not through high capacity wells. And how much land can be irrigated in the current scenario?
Depends on where your fields are located. There's holding ponds that can capture as much as 180 acres. I think it's the latest holding pond that was discussed quite extensively this past spring and summer. 180 acres. He's irrigating with a holding pond, but that actually acts as well as a catchment basin. It all depends on the location of your field. Some people are going to be able to irrigate more economically than others, and it really comes down to a business decision for individual operations.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So is that related to what Mr. Maynard said with distributed fields as opposed to centralized fields? Is that what you're...
I still think it comes down to a business decision by those individual operations, whether they want to have pipe that goes from wherever the well is located to different fields in the area. It all depends.
Steve?
But right now they don't. Right now, without access to water, I don't know.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. So as I understand it, there's different ways to irrigate as well, and some are more efficient than others. But could you tell me in a best case scenario how much a low capacity well could effectively irrigate?
I couldn't.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. This study that's being proposed here, did I hear that 4 wells are going to be put into the study and 3 of them are going to be related to a study in potatoes and 1 for another kind of crop?
Yeah, they'll all be crops grown here in PEI.
Steve?
And 3 were for potatoes and 1?
3 are for potatoes, yes. Currently, yes.
Steve?
The reason I ask is because when my colleague asked you some questions about other crops, you had mentioned that we're talking about all crops here. So it just seems like this study is very intensely focused on potatoes and high-capacity wells. So it seems like that is at the heart of what we're talking here, but it's good that we have one different study going on. But what I would ask you is, we don't seem to have the information on the low-capacity wells and their effectiveness on helping with potatoes and other various crops. I would like to see that added to this study so that we have some data knowing whether high-capacity wells are needed for certain crops, certain size farms. More data, the better, I suppose, is what I'm getting at. Would you
To get an inch of water on a crop of any kind, you're going to need a high-capacity well. So getting somewhere between 0.7, as Ron mentioned, up to an inch, you're going to need a high-capacity well if you're going to get it in a sufficient amount of time to draw down.
Steve?
So, and I'd also add that the study itself, yes, there's 3 potato operations and 1 either row crop in the form of carrots or a cole crop of some kind. It is also going to examine flow rates. It's also going to examine the viability of actually using irrigation on Prince Edward Island. So is it possible? And I suspect that the study will come out and say irrigation is possible under these circumstances, right? So which will be utilized, can be utilized quite easily by government to regulate over and above what the Water Act is already doing. So certainly if we can take a look at low capacity as a part of the study, but we need to remain focused on the fact that access to water through high-capacity wells needs to be examined, because if you're going to get an adequate amount of water on a crop in a sufficient amount of time, you need a high-capacity well.
Steve?
Or holding pond. Thank you, Chair. The groundwater recharge rate that I always see thrown around here, I've seen it as 2%. Today I saw it as we're using 1.5% of that recharge rate. Where are those numbers coming from? I saw a little asterisk there, but I didn't see any real footnotes letting us know.
It's directly out of the government of Prince Edward Island's slide deck that you saw on January 30th of 2020. That is the number that George Summers and Bruce Raymond and the minister at the time, Brad Trivers, and the deputy used when they sat here before you on that day. They used 1.5, and out of the 1.5, agriculture is using 2%. So 2% of 1.5, doing the math quite loosely, is 0.004 or something like that. I don't have a calculator, but yeah. And so the figures, to answer your question directly, the figures come from the government of Prince Edward Island.
Steve?
And if I recall that line of questioning with George Summers, well, actually it was a briefing that we had before the committee meeting, but I had asked him if he used the lower end figures, precautionary principles wise, and the answer was no. So it just casts doubt in my mind on what that number is, and it seems like we want to get water so that we can grow our crops, so that we don't have these losses. But it seems to coincide with exactly when we have the least amount of water is when we really need it. So we really have to take into factor those worst case scenarios, not the averages and whatnot. So would you agree that those numbers are what we need to be working with, the numbers that coincide with when a drought would be happening?
And that's, George also said that we could use up to 35% of our water, that we could use up to 35% of our replenish rate and still be, being environmentally sound. So if the number is 2 instead of 1.5, or the number is 3 instead of 1.5, from what I saw and from what I read in Hansard, from what he said to you, we are more than safe.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. Could you go back to your rainfall chart there? Yeah. I just need to see it again. There we are. So here's our low year, where we go down to 40-ish or so in 2020. Is that right?
This is 20, so 2020 is the low bar, yeah.
The low bar, yeah. So the median bar is up there around 100?
It's around 80, yeah.
Yeah, so that's about 40% of what the recharge rate would be. So there's a huge discrepancy there in the, this would directly affect.
This is rainfall. This is.
Which directly affects the recharge rate. No?
Yeah, it's not the only factor.
Steve?
It's not the only factor, it's a direct relation. It's not the only factor. But it's,
As we heard in the previous presentation, rainfall is only one factor where groundwater actually comes from, right?
Steve?
a huge factor.
Yeah, snowmelt is a major factor as well, right? So this is rain that fell in April that's measuring just over 20 millimeters. But you got to remember that we had a lot of snow in January, February, March that then melted. We had a lot of rain in terms of thaws. Like, that's just rainfall in April. That's all that is showing you is that very little rain fell in 2020. That's all that's showing you.
Months or 4 months, whatever, where moisture level is much higher.
That's all that shows.
Steve?
It doesn't show the other months where the moisture level is much higher, which is what Dr. Van Heuvel, and which is, we all know that, it rains, the patterns are there. It rains more in the spring and the fall on Prince Edward Island. And then, of course, snow in the winter.
Steve?
Thank you, Chair. I guess the bottom line of what I'm trying to get at is that from a scientific precautionary principle approach, we should be always using the worst case scenario when we're determining. It seems like, to me, there's going to be lots of water there, but we should be using that worst case scenario, not an average, because exactly when the need is there is exactly when those numbers are the worst. So beyond just the precautionary principle, from a scientific principle of what numbers we should be using, would you agree that those are the numbers most relevant to when the farmers truly need the water?
I'm sorry, are you arguing for the precautionary principle to be applied to the research project? Is that what you want? Is that what you're asking?
Steve?
I'm saying that the worst case numbers that we have are the ones that coincide with when the farmers need irrigation, truly need it, not a want, but a need. It'd be nice to always be able to grow more, of course, but the years in which we have the least amount of recharge is the years that we should be using as our baseline.
I trust that Dr. Michael Van Heuvel will apply the best science that he can to this research project, and he's he's the expert on these types of things. I'd leave that to him.
Steve, I'm just gonna go around here. Rob?
Thanks, Chair. I'm still trying to get my blood pressure down here a bit, and I'm almost fightable here to a certain degree for some of the questions that were put out there. I think it comes from a complete lack of understanding of what it's like to be a farmer in Prince Edward Island. And as a former Minister of Agriculture and as a former farmer, I want to just add a few comments into this equation or whatever. The reality is that farmers, they can't necessarily wait into the very, very long term to try to get some solutions here to some of the challenges that they're faced with. Bankers won't allow it as the first issue. As far as climate change 50 years down the road, bankers aren't going to bankroll farmers for another 50 years. It's just a hard reality, and I know the Minister of Finance is probably bankrolling a fair number of farmers, and I'm sure they feel a bit nervous about this. We are dictated as farmers based on markets, the demand for those particular markets, and what our bankers will allow us to do, whether there's any profitability in this. And so I think we have to put that into the equation and the reality. When it comes to comments about crop temperatures for potatoes, yes, there's a myriad of factors that put stresses on a crop that you grow. I've been a potato farmer. I know what the stresses are like when you get a lot of windy days, as an example. That can be a stress on hot days. Can be a stress. You can see the potatoes will wilt down. But there are so many varieties of potatoes that are out there. There's probably thousands of varieties of potatoes with the World Potato Congress, and they adapt. The potato's not that particular variety, but there's many different varieties. But farmers are still having to deliver a certain variety of potatoes for a consumer market in the end of the day. So the reality is choosing all these different varieties isn't necessarily going to be the panacea of solution to many farmers. Even each particular variety, the timing of when you plant a potato, when it gets the moisture and the run of the day, the season, there's so many factors. So I think as questions, we've got to be careful here of getting down into the minutiae of trying to deal with every little possible panacea of a problem that's going to create it there. Let's get to the core issue here, and this is providing farmers with an irrigation option that's a tool for many farmers. Farmers will figure this out to the degree that, as far as the viability and profitability of whether they invest in that. I'm quite confident of a banker when you show some of those numbers of the 200. I know what a 200 hundredweight crop looks like. I hate to even see a 170 hundredweight crop look like. When you go to your banker, they're going to say, and you said you've got a possible solution here, you could put irrigation in, and it's a $200,000 investment, $300,000, whatever the number. That's going to depend on the size of the field. There's a lot of factors that go into that. I'm pretty sure a banker's going to probably lend you the money in that if you can guarantee you're going to take one of those risk factors or stress factors out of the equation. So let's let farmers deal with that. They'll figure that out. And there's lots of different varieties of irrigation. So they'll figure that part of it out as far as that goes. So I think that's something we need to deal with. Or the other issue that's going to happen here, we're all going to have to pay more for our crop or for our product that we buy. If 200 hundredweight is going to be the new norm for farmers, based on climate change, based on all the different factors that are out there, you're going to have to pay a lot more, or you're going to have to switch to something else to eat as the public and consumers. So I think one of the things I want to kind of state, this is plain and simple. This is an issue of discrimination. You're not banning, and the other members are questioning whether you should do it in golf courses, should do car washes, or whatever. This is discrimination. You've picked out one industry, and you've discriminated against them to say that they can't have access to a resource that all science seems to be saying that there's a fair bit of it. You can question whether governments or authorities of water or whatever want to say you can use it at certain times of the year and things of that nature. The reality of what I see, rainfall doesn't indicate all about recharge. Recharge is really through the winter, the snows, the melt, how fast that melts and how little runoff and whether it gets absorbed in. I'm certainly seeing lots of recharge of what I see around my farm. I really feel for the farmer who's renting my land at the moment on the crop of potatoes. He's planted them late, he's hanging in there, but there's just not the moisture there to make that situation or that farm profitable. So farmers, you fellas seem to be the most patient group that I've ever seen. You've waited 18 years to do that, to see something happen here. How patient are you as farmers, and how long are you going to wait for this discrimination to end?
Well, I guess, you know, we would like to see the discrimination end today. And it needs to end today. But you talked about the bankers. You're correct. They're not going to wait for alternate crops to be developed over the next 10 to 20 years. 10% decrease in yield means you're making no money. A 20% decrease in yield means that you're asking the question, do I plant next year? A 30% decrease in yield, somebody else is making the decision whether you plant next year. That's the reality out there. It's a tool that we on Prince Edward Island do not have. We have to compete with our suppliers across the world. They have that option. We don't.
Rob?
Okay, so what would you consider as an indication of a movement, or some decision that someone has to make to end this discrimination?
Well, the first thing is to approve the project that Dr. Van den Heuvel has put forward, and then start developing a strategy. Start looking at saying, instead of saying no, 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 say, okay, what kind of an irrigation strategy can we do? Holding ponds, whatever. You know, let's get the departments together to work on a strategy instead of saying no. We're tired of hearing no.
Rob?
So what are you going to do about it?
That's up to you folks.
That's why we're here.
Rob?
I think you know, farmers want to be reasonable. You know, we most certainly realize that we don't want to, in any way, shape, or form, do damage to our land, our air, and our water. Those are the things that we make our living on.
Rob?
Okay, I'll just shift a little bit here to one other question I had, and it goes back to the 4 Rs, and I guess I was the minister that helped sign on to that principle, which is it's a North American, maybe global principle. And it looks to me that irrigation would take away many of those variables to those principles, or would it enhance the variables, in other words, make them better for farmers?
Absolutely make them better. I mean, I was part of the team that brought forward as a PI myself, and developed by the International Plant Nutrition Institute, promoted around the world by both Fertilizer Canada and other respected institutions, a lot of farm groups, including this one. You can put, the right source of fertilizer down at the right time, right rate, right place. But if there isn't any water or any rain, then it just sits there. And we've pulled tops this past August in different potato fields in particular, where there was literally fertilizer sitting there, whether it was still granular or it was sludge. And that crop was either dead or dying. So the uptake of that fertilizer is very unlikely, which means that it will further exacerbate our nitrate problems here in the province. So, a lot of the same people that oppose irrigation oppose, as they should, the increased nitrate levels in our water supply. So, we're looking at not only becoming more efficient as a farming community, but we're also looking at trying to have a positive environmental impact at the same time.
Rob?
Okay, thank you very much, and I agree that I think it'll only enhance, irrigation will only enhance that, and once again, make better uses of our irrigation, or our fertilizers, and not let them have the potential damage that they have when we can't control them as far as that goes. But I guess in the end of the day, I'm certainly going to say I encourage you to force and push government. I'll do the same. I'm embarrassed as a former Minister of Agriculture that I didn't get this done sooner under when I was Minister of Agriculture. But anyway, we're still a year and a half down the road. It's still not happening. So I certainly would endorse, let's get on with this. Let's let Dr. Van de Heuvel do the tests. My personal belief is I think that the science is there, that this can be done without very many impacts on sustainability of our water resources, but the research will confirm that and what impacts it might have on aquatic life. I think that's ultimately what we're trying to deal with here in the research, and if that comes through like I suspect it will, then let's move on and let's lift this moratorium. I think ultimately let's end this discrimination in agriculture. Thanks, Chair.
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Ron and Robert, for coming in. I really appreciate the presentation. One of the questions I asked Dr. Van de Heuvel was about the effects of the ability for uptake in fertilizer if there is irrigation versus not. And I know you had the slide there about the yield or the size of potatoes. Is there any farmer who is looking at that as far as, one field he irrigated and he used, so many tons or whatever of fertilizer versus one that wasn't irrigated, and, do you have any information around that?
Well, I can tell you that right now, if you're growing a crop and you're putting down fertilizer, the biggest way you're doing that is either you're broadcasting before you plant, or you're literally putting it in the planter or the seeder. So it all goes in. It all goes down in the spring. With irrigation, you're allowed to spoon feed the crop. You would be putting less down at planting time than you are now, and it will allow you through fertigation, so adding liquid fertilizer to your irrigation, you're able to spoon feed the crop with time. So in the end of the day, not only are you seeing less leaching, you're seeing probably less fertilizer usage overall. So it's the most efficient way to actually apply fertilizer.
Darlene?
Thanks for that. We talk about the number of tools in the toolbox, and I mentioned to Dr. Van de Heuvel earlier, and I believe Stephen brought it up as well. We know, the organic matter in the soil is very important. Crop rotation, buffer zones, and the watersheds that any high-capacity well could impact. I think those would all be factors that I would look at as a member of government to issue a permit. And I'm just wondering if you want to comment on, if we look at your farm, for instance, and you want to put in a high-capacity well, if you have information on all of those, different factors that go into better farming practices, how you would look at that if government says, okay, show us some detail on any of those particular issues that would impact your farm, and what the balance would be with high-capacity well, and how government could be part of that, I guess, as far as ensuring that you have the information you need to prove that a high-capacity well, because you've already done you're already doing crop rotation, you're already looking at and doing buffer zones, and you're already looking at and have good organic matter in your soil. So I don't know if you can comment on how government can partner with you if we look at doing high-capacity wells and giving you a permit. What of those factors, how would we work together to ensure those factors are in place?
Certainly, as we've said in our slide, and the history has been, and we work with government, we work with we work together, and so we're more than willing, anytime, any place, anywhere, to sit down with people that want to move an irrigation strategy forward. Right now, there hasn't been a discussion, because the answer is no. You're not even allowed in the door. So we want to sit down with industry, with government, and work out an irrigation strategy.
Darlene?
If you know the rules, then you go along and adapt to the rules. Right now, the rule is no.
Darlene?
Thank you, Chair. Dr. Van der Heuvel talked about negative and positive impacts of climate change, and the climate is always changing, has always changed, and that's something that I firmly believe in. And there are positive and negative impacts, and one he mentioned was, freeze-thaw, which gives more recharge to the ground, but could freeze the fish because it's cooling the water, and that there are solutions for that, by planting trees and ensuring that we've got, better nutrients going into the water. So I'm a big proponent of ensuring that we are good stewards of the land, and if there are ways that we can mitigate this or ways that we can look at doing what needs to be done so that farmers have the best yield that they can and still work within the parameters of the environment. And I do believe, as Robert Henderson said, it comes down to fairness, and we can all say, well, we don't want to irrigate golf courses. Well, maybe we don't care if tourists come here to golf. We're not going to let municipalities take as much water. Well, people are migrating into urban areas, so there are positives and negatives. Do we want people to wash their cars? Do we want cruise ships, if they ever get to come again? Do we want them here because they use so much water? So every decision we make, there are positives and negatives, and I think that it's very important that we as a government, and I said earlier to Dr. Van der Heuvel, this has been kicked down the road too far, and I really want to see our government come to a decision about that, and we're willing to work with you. And I think if we look at the positives and negatives together, and that there are not just, this is not the silver bullet that we can accomplish what we need to do. So I just want to thank you for coming in.
Thank you. Miners Mud, as we said in our slide, it's one of the tools in our toolbox, and we want to use all of those tools.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Robert and Ron, for coming in. I really appreciate that. A couple of initial things, and I didn't ask any questions on the first presentation as well, but I don't think anybody, you had mentioned it, some of your questions or responses earlier was about, whether you might question if any of us think irrigation is important or not. I don't think that's the question at all. Everybody knows that irrigation is very important across the world and here in PEI. Ron, you had just mentioned that the rule is the answer is no right now. The rule is no right now, and the rule isn't no right now. You can irrigate. It's just you can't irrigate with high capacity wells. So my first question is, how many of your members are irrigating with something other than a high capacity well right now?
I don't have that figure off the top of my head, but once again, as Rob has laid out, if you're going to put the water, the amount on that's most economical, then you need a high capacity well.
I can answer part of that. I could say that, so there's 36 irrigation high capacity wells on PEI, and then there's about another 20 to 30 holding ponds constructed across PEI. So you're looking at, and some of those holding ponds are actually owned by people who also have high capacity wells. So you're looking somewhere between 30 and 50 operations that are currently allowed to operate out of about 600 plus farm operations on PEI. So a very small percentage.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. So you ones that are using irrigation without a high capacity well, you say there's 20 to 30 holding ponds, and some of them are actually filling their holding ponds with a high capacity well. So it's probably...
No, most of them are filling their holding ponds either through catchment basins. Like I know one vegetable operation has 2 catchment ponds, for example, and some of them are using low capacity wells to fill, multiple low capacity wells in some cases, to actually fill their holding ponds.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. Okay, so a survey of the industry, how many would invest in a high capacity well given the opportunity?
That's a question that we'd actually literally have to put to the farmers of PEI, but I can tell you from the phone calls, the emails, the amount of angst probably all of you have gotten from farmers across PEI, there would be interest in at least exploring the option, which they currently do not have, right? And I want to add too, Sydney, that it's much more efficient economically for you to dig a well for $15,000 to $20,000 and buy irrigation equipment than to invest in a holding pond. So, no, the answer is not definitively no. You can build a holding pond so far, but it's much more economically efficient for you to dig a holding pond. And unless it is, if you're going to irrigate, that's what you want to do.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate that. I have to clarify too, Robert, though, I've only been elected 5 years, unlike the former Minister of Agriculture here who found his voice today, which is great also. But only 5 years, and the only person that has contacted me personally to ask for high-capacity wells is Robert Irvin, and that's just the fact now. Having said that, I bet you tomorrow there might be more, but that's the truth of it in 5 years, and that could be just where I'm at in geography and PEI. But so going back to irrigation, it's in your opinion that it's only worthwhile to invest in irrigation if you can access a high capacity well. Is that?
It is more worth your while. It is more economically efficient to use a high capacity well than a holding pond. I don't think there's any question of that, because a holding pond is fairly expensive to construct, right? You're looking at somewhere around $500,000, to build a holding pond that is sufficient enough to feed, a sizable, like a medium-sized farm, for example. So if you're going to seriously consider irrigating your crop, then you want the ability to utilize a high-capacity well.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. So if it just makes it more economic sense, why aren't more people just using holding ponds now?
Because they're very expensive. They're very, very expensive. And, again, and there's a lot of public pushback on that. You think about this, a holding pond versus a well, which is bigger, which is more visible, so, and you're adding cost to what, I already talked about $15,000 to $20,000 to dig one well, and then $200,000 to $300,000 on a piece of irrigation equipment, and then you add potentially $500,000 or more in terms of building a pond, and you've got to really think long and hard before you invest that amount. You're talking $1 million, just to get access to water. And we're saying today that, and we've been saying now for 18 years that's not acceptable. The only reason that they can't go get a high capacity well, which is the preferred route, which is actually less environmental impact, really, at the end of the day, you just simply can't do it. We've been discriminated against now for 18 years, and we've come today with a very transparent, reasonable approach by saying here's a team of scientists that just want to examine whether or not this is a viable option here on PEI. And yes, there are multiple questions to his research proposal, and maybe that's the route. We need to sit down collectively and hammer out what questions he needs to ask. But I think that at the end of the day, to put our heads in the sand and say, we shouldn't even look at this as an option. We shouldn't consider research on this topic so important. It's I got to tell you, I'm not even speaking for me here, but the amount of producers I've talked to about this option, it's just downright frustrating. It's we're at to bury our heads in the sand. I don't know on what other topic we would find that acceptable in modern society here in Prince Edward Island. But when it comes to irrigation for agriculture, we seem to be terrified to even ask the question of whether or not it's even viable.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. It's like you're reading my sheet here. I feel like the terms of reference that you two have spoke about today for this study and the terms of reference that the previous presenter had spoke about are different. And I don't sit on this committee, but I'm curious to know, what is publicly available? What can you tell us about what the terms of reference of that study would be? And because all those things are relevant, but I've just heard two different views of what the results might be.
I don't think you have. At the end of the day, maybe I'm oversimplifying what he was saying. He is the expert. It's his research project at the end of the day. We are supportive of any research that's going to look at agriculture irrigation as a possibility using high capacity wells. He is going to, the terms of reference as well he talked about a management committee, an oversight committee. That oversight committee, there's the terms of reference there on what they would actually do, but I can tell you one big thing they're going to do is determine what questions, work with that research team to determine on what questions we will zero in on, right? I don't think that you're hearing two different opinions. We're very supportive of what we've seen from Dr. Michael Van Heuvel, from what we heard him say to you today. Again, I got to reiterate, any research that's going to comprehensively review whether or not agriculture irrigation is possible in this province, we are supportive of.
Sydney?
No, I'm not hearing two different opinions. And quite frankly, you're not oversimplifying it. You're giving me details of what might be in it versus actually what the last one was the bigger question. So I welcome this. But my question is, have you seen a detailed terms of reference on this?
I've seen his entire proposal, and I know that the government of Prince Edward Island has as well. We're getting to a point now that we're just looking for a green light to zero down on the finite minutia of his research proposal, how it's going to be funded, things of that nature. It's very hard to do that without a permit to actually go ahead and dig a well. Because if you can't get a permit to dig a well, then you're just wasting your time. And we've been working on this now for a considerable amount of time, over years. I think he drew this up and as long ago as 4 years ago, right? So we've been talking about this for quite a long time. The Federation of Agriculture, in June decided that this is such a big issue that we need to be the primary partner. So, we're investing a lot of time. We're looking for you, this committee, to recommend to government that we move forward with at least the permitting of wells so we can all sit down and figure out exactly how this is going to work.
Sydney?
Thank you, Chair. If the research project has presented a terms of reference to government, and this committee is reviewing the regulations that would eventually allow for something like this, I would think this committee should see that terms of reference. And I don't know if the committee has it. I don't think they have by any means. I'll move that motion if I'm allowed to later, Chair. I don't know why we would not have seen that already, to be quite frank.
Well, I think his presentation today was a presentation that was centered on his proposal itself. From what I saw. I mean, I did watch it in the other room, but that's what I saw.
Sydney?
Thank you. The presentation was great, but the terms of reference, I have a ton of questions on the details of it and what we're going to find out, and just like you would, and that you've seen, like what are the actual questions that we're going to answer. You talked about you need an inch of water in order to get that irrigation on that. I mean, is that for all crops? Is that just for the potato ones? Is it? There's a whole. Anyway, I won't get into that detail, but we'll find it out. But my question about that slide that you were doing, and I assume there's research being done in that field, that the irrigation versus non-irrigation, is that a high capacity well?
Well, no. The slide with the potatoes that you saw. Yes. He's. That is a high capacity.
Well, yeah, it's a pivot. It's a pivot irrigation. That's what when we're talking about high capacity wells, we're talking about a pivot irrigation. And that's the most effective way and efficient way to get water on a potato field or on a lot of different crop fields.
Sydney?
Thank you. So is there a study going on in that field?
Yes, on organic matter there is, but on irrigation there's not.
Sydney?
So it was just like an anecdotal picture to say, look, this is what irrigation does in a moment in time.
Irrigation looks like versus non-irrigation in 2020, especially.
This farmer is also part of the group that they monitor, ongoing monitoring of moisture levels through the deck.
East Prince Environment Unit.
Our Environment Association. There's, I think, a dozen farmers that are involved in this, and they have a technician that goes to the field on a regular basis and does the monitoring, and they can, that's how they determine how much water, how much irrigation they need, if they needed irrigation. And
they help them with a variety of different tools, as we've spoken about, in terms of that are in a toolbox in growing a crop. you know, like, I have to reiterate that we understand and believe that irrigation is no silver bullet, that there are multiple facets to growing an efficient crop, regardless of what that is. But I mean, without water, you can't grow grass. So you can't expect food to grow any more sustainably, right?
Sydney?
Thank you, and that's an example of you talk about, it sounds like a study that's looking at all the tools in the toolbox, not just one, and I think that's important. I'll leave it there, Chair, but I do want to know the details of this, if this committee is going, and me as a legislature. I'm not a member of Executive Council, so I have not been privy to any of that information, but I look forward to seeing it. Thank you, Chair.
Michelle?
Okay, thanks, Chair. And again,
Sorry.
Just to
Mr. Maynard?
respond to, we haven't surveyed our, the question's been asked a couple of times about how many people would go into irrigation. We haven't surveyed our members because the question is new, because we haven't even been allowed to apply for a permit. If it's for agricultural irrigation, nope.
Yeah, Sydney?
Thank you. If you haven't surveyed your members on, why are you pushing for it?
We have a resolution from our membership in January of 2014. That's why we're pushing it. It was unanimously passed after Bruce Raymond presented the facts on water. And then we took that back to the board earlier this year to make sure that we were still supportive of it. And again, it was passed. And then we took Michael Van Heuvel and we put him in front of our board of directors in June. And it was passed after he left that we would join as a primary partner, because we believe the issue is very significant. And then we had a summer where we got zero rain, and we have crop failure in some cases, or borderline crop failure in some cases. That's why we're here.
You asked for a specific number. We don't have that specific number because we haven't surveyed.
Sydney?
Did you have input onto the 3 confirmed farmers that will be using the high-capacity well so far?
What do you mean input? What do you mean by that?
Do you know who they are?
Yes.
And who are they?
Sydney?
They're Jonathan McClellan in Western PEI, Brian Cousins in Central PEI, and they're Rollo Bay Holdings in Eastern PEI.
Sydney?
Yeah, they had the names on them. In Van den Heuvel's presentation, the names were there.
I appreciate that.
And we're exploring a vegetable farm as well. And we've been in talks with the PI Horticultural Council in determining who that will be.
Good. All right. Michelle?
great, thanks, Chair. And I too would like to say thank you for coming and for presenting to us. And I'm going to echo what a number of members have already brought up. For some of us, this is the first time that we're even seeing the details of the request for research and what the project looks like. And I guess from my perspective, I've been lobbied from some farmers to agree with it and to back it. But it's really hard to support something when you haven't seen the details of it. And so I think that is an important piece of this, is to understand what it is that's actually being asked for. And so I just would like to say, when I was elected and I became critic of agriculture for the official opposition, I asked a number of people, what do I need to be doing in order to do my job? And the two things that most identified was deal with public perception and land issues. And so what I would like to address right now is public perception, because I feel like you have farmers fighting, for their reputations because of a lot of what's going on right now. And I think that that's unfair, because I don't think that a farmer should have to fight for the reputation based on the fact that they're looking for what we all agree that they need, and that is irrigation or access to water. What we're discussing is how do they get that access. And so I think that there is a really big picture that needs to be discussed within agriculture, and that is a strategy, a complete strategy in what's going on in the industry versus what the public believes might be going on in the industry, because I don't think the two match up to some extent. So I do think that from an overall perspective, we really need to look at that divide, because I feel like that divide is getting greater, and I don't think that that's doing anybody any benefits. So I just wanted to say that from, you know, from an overall perspective. Then we talk about irrigation strategy. So people who have to be involved in that strategy absolutely would be, the public needs to know what's going on, that's transparency. And when you don't know what's going on, there's fear that plays into making decisions. But when you don't have all of the facts and you don't have all of the information, it's really hard to, you know, to support and to be part of that whole process. So I would agree with what Sydney had just said, and I'll echo a few others. I mean, I think that this committee would benefit from actually having that proposal. And I understand, like, usually a slideshow is a summary of it, right? And that there is a long proposal that would accompany it. And I would hesitate to say that the permit is a starting point. I don't think a permit's a starting point. I think the permit is based, is something that happens because everybody's come together and decided what that strategy is going to be, and that you move forward as a group to discuss that. I hope that makes sense, but that's kind of where, like, what my overall perspective is. I do not doubt that farmers need irrigation. I've been around agriculture all my life. I've lived, you know, like, my family's been farming for a long time. So I have no doubt that agriculture needs access to water. I have seen a farmer who tried to put in a crop, and it's a rhizome type crop, and with this, you know, what they were experiencing this year, within a year, that those rhizomes would have been dead. And that is a multi-year, that's a, you know, that's a perennial type crop. And so agriculture is water is required across all crops. So I guess where I'm going with it, with what I'm saying, and I'm not sure what my questions are to you guys is, but where I'm going is, it does come down to an overall strategy, and everything is linked together. So in order to support something, though, you need the basic information in order to be able to support something. So I guess I do have a couple questions. I wanted to talk about the agri-watershed partnership, because I actually believe that they were part of this program, like part of this research project, and I understand now that that's a completely different group. But I have talked to a number from the Watershed Alliance and farmers, because they're working really, really well together, and that's a great partnership to see. But if you talk to them, they'll say not all watersheds are created equally. So if you're talking about the Panette River, for instance, versus the Dunk, the impact of water withdrawal would be different. And so I'd like to ask you, what is the partnership contributing, and how will they be pulled into this research?
So the partnership, which the Federation co-chairs, this proposal, this idea was brought to them in earlier part of this year, and it was determined at the time that that partnership has a lot on its plate. Developing an industry standard is not easy, and promoting that industry standard maybe even harder, right? So a lot of work on their plate. So they decided collectively that this would be something left off the table for now, because it just, there was 4 watersheds that were supportive of the project, the Federation of Agriculture supportive of the project, and a team of researchers. So let them do their thing, and the PI Agri-Watershed Group would concentrate on its industry standard, on mitigating fish kills, eliminating them, hopefully keeping soil in the fields, and developing this industry standard. So that's why they're not listed as someone who's involved in the project committee that you saw Michael Van Heuvel present. As for the PI Water Alliance, they've declined to participate at this time for reasons that you'll have to ask them. But again, I reiterate that, you know, the 4 watersheds that were initially approached, one of them now would no longer be involved, at least unless we get a vegetable grower in that watershed. Have all been supportive, and we're going back. Van Heuvel and myself, Dr. Van Heuvel and myself, are going back to these watersheds this fall. We're going to see one of them next week, actually, just to reaffirm that they're still supportive of the project and are willing, at least open to the idea of us doing research in the watershed. We're not asking for them to say they support irrigation or they don't support irrigation, that they're simply open to research on the topic taking place in the watershed.
Michelle?
Thank you. And I appreciate that because I guess one concern, and I understand that the island's too large, there's too many rivers, there's too many watersheds to have all of the monitoring, the baseline analysis in place, which was being discussed earlier today. But I do think that they're an integral part, and I am concerned about if this research is completed, and if that's a blanketed statement that it doesn't impact, but potentially it, you know, will it on different watersheds?
Well, again, I think that any research will come out with conditions, and the Federation will contend right off the bat that there are certain watersheds where irrigation is just not going to work, right? I think that's a reality that people are fairly aware of, or they should be aware of. It's just simply not going to work. But I think the research will show whether or not it's even something we should study further, right? Without doing the research, you know, I got to reiterate, I think we need to move forward with Van Heuvel's research. We need to look at an irrigation strategy. We need to move forward and stop just simply saying this isn't something we're going to touch, as previous governments have done now for 18 years. So, you know, and on the public trust issue, 100% agree with you. You know, in partnership with government, we have Farm Food Care, as you're well aware of, in our office at the Federation of Agriculture. A relative of yours is actually our coordinator, and she does a great job in partnership with the steering committee in pushing, you know, what food production involves here in Prince Edward Island, facts on what that involves, and tries to, you know, generate that needed discussion between consumers and the farming community. So it's a tall order, but, you know, and there's a lot of money across Canada, across North America, being invested in that very topic. So I think you should know that as well.
Michelle?
Yeah, I think she's pretty awesome. So, and I mean, that would lead me to like an example of something that's working really well is the Child and Youth Advocate Table, and you know, where that is bringing in multiple people to look at it, but it's actually bringing in, so from that perspective, it's bringing in the children and anything that impacts them and how they can work through any policies that are coming forward. And I mean, it's possible even something like that to happen through agriculture to make sure that, you know, many different groups are represented at a table, so whenever there's impacts to everybody, that you start closing that gap, because I think that that is so vitally important, is to start closing that gap. And if it's not closing right now, to go back and look as to why it's not closing. I will ask another thing, and you guys may not be able to cover this for me, but we talked about the cost to implement irrigation. I also want to understand what would the pressures from processors be when it comes to somebody who's decided to invest in irrigation versus somebody who is just determined it's not the right step for them? How do you perceive that working in the industry, and does that put people on a different playing field?
What I'd say to that is that any agreement that a grower has with a processor, regardless of crop, usually involves volume. And how they decide to achieve that is really up to them. It's a business operation, it's a business decision. So if they decide to irrigate, then they decide to irrigate. If they decide not to, then they decide not to. You know, the relationship really between any grower and any processor is simply a volume of product. So they agree on terms on, you know, I want so many 100 pounds of blueberries or thousands of pounds of potatoes or whatever it might be. It's all about volume. So how they decide to achieve that is up to them.
Michelle?
I think I'm good right
You're
now,
good.
but I would say that I think a valuable thing for the committee to do is to request the study, the terms of reference. So thank you.
I do want to say on that point, I mean, Van den Heuvel presented his study. He sat before you for 2 hours, because I watched in the other room. It was a long 2 hours. And he went into great detail, so I kind of struggle with how this committee feels that they don't have the information required to make a decision in moving forward, at least in the permitting of wells, or at least moving forward in some fashion of support on moving forward with a research project that looks at irrigation. You know, and as Ron has said, I think the Federation is, as we've done for 80-some years, is prepared to work with this committee, this government, in helping you arrive at a conclusion that we hope is supportive of what we're asking for, and we're prepared to sit down with you at any point on that. And I think that, you know, I won't speak for Van den Heuvel, but I venture to guess that he would as well.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. And I can fully appreciate that we have been here a long time. I will try to keep You're not wrong. I will try to keep this section of questions pretty short in respect for everyone here. But you had indicated that configuration of farms and land has a huge impact on whether or not it's realistic for high-capacity wells anyway. And in lots of cases it isn't, just because fields are spread out or the way that they're organized. But I think one thing we've all agreed on, I don't hear anyone disagreeing on this point, is that access to water in some capacity is going to be an essential part of farming staying viable into the future. And I would just love, while I have you here, to get ideas or insight from both of you on how we are going to support farmers for whom high-capacity wells is just plainly not a realistic option. We agree irrigation is an important piece. Irrigation can look like a lot of different things. We know water is a critical component for food to be able to grow. When we have the vast majority of farms for whom high-capacity wells will not be realistic anyway, what do you need us to know? What do we do to support farming to be viable, pushing those one topic aside?
Well, one thing you should do is not place a moratorium on holding ponds, right? But beyond that, you look at your business risk management programs at the federal level that keep people, hold them through a bad year or a bad string of years. They're, I would argue, insufficient, and I think that the Department of Agriculture and Land here has done a fairly good job of showing that to them and saying that you know, you've got to have a catastrophic year loss of 30%. In order to even access those programs, the province here has said, if you drop below 15%, then we'll jump in and at least support you in some measure. You know, Ron, I guess I'll look at you to help on what else that they can be doing. I mean, supporting research of any kind.
You talked about biodiversity, you know, earlier on. Yeah, most certainly. I mean, I think we need to encourage people. I mean, I drove down by this morning, WA Grains, you know, and I'm amazed at the amount of storage space they have there at Slemon Park, that, you know, right next to where your shop is. You know, and the diversity that they have brought. And I think we have to create a climate, an environment that wants people to come here. And I mean, you know, as the Minister of Agriculture says, not having access to water is a negative aspect. We have a hop grower that's in Nova Scotia now that should have been on Prince Edward Island.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I feel like we've circled around my point. even with holding ponds, as you indicated earlier, it's a far more expensive option. You're talking about like $500,000. So for farms that are not suited to high-capacity wells, how do we get access to water for these people? We can say we're not being supportive of water. How is that even a viable option? What do we need to do? Insurance policies do not equal irrigation. We're all agreeing that what we need is water. Every crop, regardless of whether it's potatoes or carrots or tomatoes. I mean, all of the organic farmers that I know are also struggling this year. But high-capacity wells are not going to be an option for a great many island farmers, if not the majority of island farmers. It still doesn't solve the problem that we are facing, which is a shortage of rainfall. High-capacity wells is not a solution for many farmers. What are you proposing is a solution that reaches more farmers for whom high-capacity wells wouldn't be a fit anyway?
We're looking at the government to continue to support that toolbox that we talked about. You know, whether no matter what it is, right now we're asking about that toolbox to be irrigation. And I think we're asking the government to support us in doing so.
So I just want to clarify. So you're saying for those people that can't get water, how do they get water?
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. What I'm saying is a high-capacity well, as you have indicated to us in committee, is not a viable alternative for most farms. You had said depending on the configuration of the land, configuration of the fields, it's not a business case that everyone could make.
Not everyone,
And-
but I never said the vast majority, and that's not what I said.
So if
Lynn?
it's, thank you, Chair, for farms that high-capacity wells aren't an option, are you of the impression that's the only way to irrigate?
What we're here today to talk about is whether or not research on the topic is something we should move forward with. And we are 100% supportive of Van and Heuvel moving forward with the research project on supplemental irrigation.
Lynn?
Thank you, Chair. I know this is my last question, so I'm going to try to encompass a lot into this, but I'm jumping off on something Sydney had said. You've yet to present us with a percentage of how many farms would even be prepared to take this step. Of the farms that I have spoken to, many of them tell me again and again that even if it were an option, they would not be in a position to move forward with a high-capacity well, even if they could. We know that the climate is changing, despite previous presentations suggesting otherwise. The impacts of that are here now, and farmers are feeling that now. And I am woefully concerned that we spend so much time talking about high-capacity wells, which only have major impacts for a small percentage of potato farmers, that we are missing the plot on this story, that we need irrigation for farming. And I think we need to have a broader conversation on what steps a full irrigation strategy that doesn't just look at high-capacity wells, but looks at a myriad of tools, including soil organic matter, which in and of itself is not the solution alone. I agree, we need access to water. I'm wondering if you are looking at studies that are happening in Europe. I'm wondering if you are looking at examples in other places, because this problem is not PEI unique. This is true in all kinds of places.
It is unique, though, that PEI is the only jurisdiction that you've spoke of that does not have access to irrigation. Right? I think that's unique. And I also want to, if you allow me for a second, percentage of farms that use irrigation has been a moot point. We don't have access to it, so why would we discuss it unless you're going to build a holding pond, right? So I can't give you numbers on how many people are interested in irrigation because people aren't talking about it if it's not a viable option. If I'm a farmer this year, I'm focusing on how do I get the most out of my crop without water, and it's been a struggle. So, are there people interested in it that aren't saying anything? Absolutely. And then, it's a business decision on whether they use irrigation or not. So I'm still struggling to to understand, like we're here today to talk about a research proposal with Dr. Michael Van Heuvel and moving that forward. So I'm still struggling to understand what your question has to do with that and how, you've indicated that you're supportive of water and the need for water, and I'm glad to hear that because that's what we're here to say, right? So I'm struggling to find the question that you're really asking me to answer here.
Okay, Lynn?
You asked me, Chair, that's not my fault. So for clarity, I think that the questions that we ask at the beginning, at the onset, are critically important to how we understand an issue in context. I think we could focus on a hyper-specific piece and miss the plot of the story. And the reality is, farming on PEI will not be viable into the future without a plan. That won't happen by accident. Even if we had access to high-capacity wells tomorrow, it doesn't solve that issue for a lot of people. So I am disappointed that you are not interested in having a conversation around what we need to do more broadly, but I will have to accept that that is your feeling.
So these two slides that we went through earlier talk about what we're doing outside of water. So this one, the PEI Watershed Partnership, talks about the mitigation or elimination of fish kills, keeping soil in the fields, and developing an industry standard that is essentially a code of practice on how we should farm within 200 feet of water, 200 meters of waterways. Here is a great deal, just a tip of the iceberg of some of the things that are happening in the industry now that have nothing to do with water. $2.4 million in the Living Labs project here in PEI focused on soil and soil health. An incredibly important, yet another tool in the toolbox. An entire report on GHG emissions and greenhouse gas emissions that also tackles the management practices of fields, so cover crops, reduced tillage, increased rotations, alternative rotational crops, tile drainage, and other things of that nature. And I might add that there's an awful pile of research, and I mean millions of dollars of research, taking place not just in PEI, but across Canada and across North America on those very things. So to say that we're not looking at, that we're missing the plot, that we're focused on things other than water, is simply not true. And we have been focusing on all the tools because we need to, and irrigation is simply one we don't have. So we've asked for a lifting of the moratorium. That has not happened. We have gone back and said, okay, let's be transparent. Let's find some independent experts that are willing to do that. They have come together. They've come to you today to say, here's what we'd like to do. And we're simply here saying, let's move forward with the research on one tool that we simply don't have access to. So I urge this committee, again, to support Van Heuvel's proposal, move forward, let's get off the ground, moving forward on looking at this one tool that we simply are not studying on PEI, despite all the other money that's going into every other tool.
The other aspect of it, we will sit down anytime, any place, anywhere and talk about an irrigation strategy.
Yeah.
But let's include everything on that irrigation strategy. That includes high-capacity wells, and that's the issue right now, that's not on the table. And so if you're having a discussion, well, let's have a discussion about the whole gamut of irrigation and irrigation strategy, whether it be high-capacity wells, whether it be holding ponds, whether it be drip irrigation, whatever. Let's look at, this is a resource that is important to every person on Prince Edward Island. So let's take a look at how we manage it and not saying no. I apologize for getting emotional.
Steve, for our final question.
Thank you, Chair. Just exactly what you were just talking about there, Mr. Maynard. The no sentiment seems to come from a lack of public trust in the data and is the water there to give. I don't think there's an islander walking around here that wouldn't want to see farmers succeed. You gave us the numbers on how critical it is to so many islanders and whatnot. And so just on that vein, I would urge you, I've not yet to see the proposal, so I don't know exactly what's in it, but speaking to the previous presenter, he was very unclear on climate change science, and I just went through a couple of government websites since I last spoke here, and indeed we are forecasting more rain and less snow, and The snow is what gives us an awful lot more of our recharge and things like this. And so I would just, if you want that public trust, err on the side of caution. Use the lower numbers. And I've also heard you say that, you know, even if it's 6% instead of 2% or 1.5%, then what's the big deal? And with such a large cushion, the data that you present from this study, if it has holes in it, such as we didn't consider that there's going to be less snowfall and less recharge that comes from it, it's just going to leave another hole for the public to say, well, what if? So if you err on the side of caution with this study, you will have much greater success with gaining that public trust. And so it's not really a question I have for you, but just something I would urge you to put into this proposal or alter this proposal. And as I said, I haven't seen it yet, so it's hard to say whether it contains it or not, but it does not sound like it. So more public trust means using the lower end figures and not trying to cherry coat anything. We seem to have all sorts of water. That seems to be what's being said, so let's just prove it.
Program. Thank you.
All right. Well, thank you very much, and appreciate answering, you know, probably over 50 questions I think I have marked down here, so it's, and I think we could probably keep going, but time's of the essence here, so. We're just going to recess for 1 quick minute while you pack up. Okay, and so next on the agenda, we have consideration of request to present made by the PEI Coalition for the Protection of PEI Water. Catherine O'Brien reached out on behalf of the group and would like to come in and present. What are the committee's thoughts? Would that be okay? Good. All right. So we'll invite them in. Do we have any new business?
Sure.
Sorry. Sydney?
Chair, I had spoken earlier, I'd like to move a motion, but I'm not a member of your committee, so I would love suggesting to any members that sit on the committee that they put a motion forward that says we request the terms of reference or the proposal for this study.
So moved.
Lynn, would you like to move that motion?
Just did.
Could you say them?
I move that we request the terms of reference for the proposed study that we have been hearing about today, so that we can understand in its entirety what the scope of research is about.
Is that good, Clerk? Any discussion on that? Notice. All in favor? Aye?
Aye.
Good. All right. Motion carried. Any further new business? No? Motion to adjourn? Someone. Robert, thank you. Adjourned.